Hi guys, did you know ancient Greek snails could sleep for up to 3 years, and sometimes woke up after being sold as decorative shells? Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them thinking, wait, people in California listen to history stories to sleep. Okay, tonight we are talking about the art of snail farming in ancient Greece. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. You're standing in a small grove just outside the city walls of Athens. And it's the kind of morning where the light comes through the olive trees at exactly the right angle to make everything look like it's been dipped in honey. The air smells like wild thyme and dust and that particular Mediterranean combination of hot stone and vegetation that's just slightly too dry. Sitting under the olive tree, you daydream about how you can become rich. At that moment, a brilliant business idea comes to your mind. You'll decide to become a snail farmer. It sounds absurd, until you find out that wealthy Romans once paid outrageous sums for a particular species of edible snail. The Greeks call these creatures koklos, and they're not talking about the little garden snails you'd find eating your basil plant in a modern suburb. These are the big ones, the ones that grow to the size of a child's fist if you feed them correctly, and keep them alive long enough. Which is harder than it sounds because snails are simultaneously resilient and incredibly fragile in ways that will drive you slightly insane over the coming months. The whole enterprise started because someone, probably several generations ago, noticed that land snails tasted pretty good when cooked with wine and herbs. And that observation turned into a minor culinary obsession among people with too much money and not enough practical problems to worry about. Now you're standing here with a clay pot in one hand and a basket in the other, looking at a patch of rocky ground near a limestone outcropping where snails tend to congregate during the wet season. It's not wet season anymore, which is why you're going to have to create an artificial environment that tricks these mollusks into thinking it's perpetually spring, a season they apparently find deeply appealing for reasons that have to do with moisture and temperature, and calcium availability in the soil. You don't know all of this yet, but you're about to learn it through a combination of trial, error, and conversations with an old man named Philon who lives 3 valleys over, and who has been farming snails since before you were born. Philon has opinions about everything, including the moral character of different snail species, and you're going to spend a lot of time nodding while he talks. The site you've chosen sits on a gentle slope that faces north, which seems counterintuitive because most crops prefer southern exposure for the sunlight, but snails are not most crops and they have their own peculiar requirements. They don't like direct sun for extended periods because it dries them out and makes them retreat into their shells and seal themselves in with a mucus door that hardens into something resembling parchment. And once they've done that, they can stay dormant for months or even years, waiting for conditions to improve. This is excellent for their survival but terrible for your business model, because dormant snails don't eat and don't grow and certainly don't reproduce, and all 3 of those activities are essential to your success. You need them active, hungry, and in the mood for romance, which means keeping them consistently moist and comfortable at all times, a task that's going to require more attention than you'd give to a moderately demanding pet. You've chosen this particular spot because it's close enough to the city that you can walk there in less than an hour, but far enough away that nobody's going to accidentally stumble onto your operation and ask uncomfortable questions about why you're spending so much time staring at invertebrates. The land belongs to a man named Cleomenes, who owns about 40 olive trees and a small vineyard, and who doesn't particularly care what you do with the rocky, useless section of his property as long as you pay him a modest annual fee, and occasionally bring him a jar of the garum fish sauce that everyone in the Mediterranean seems to be obsessed with lately. Cleomenes is probably in his 60s, which in ancient Greece means he's either going to live another 20 years or die next week. There's really no way to predict these things. And he has the kind of weathered face that suggests he spent his entire life squinting at the sun and making decisions about agriculture based on the colour of the soil and the behaviour of insects. He thinks your snail farming idea is mildly amusing in the way that wealthy men find the ambitious projects of younger people amusing. Like you're a child who's announced plans to dig a tunnel to Persia, but he's seen stranger business ventures succeed, so he's willing to let you try. The first thing you need to do is build what the Romans will later call a cochlearium, though the Greeks don't have a specific word for it yet because the industry is still fairly new and terminology hasn't been standardized. Basically, you need an enclosed space where snails can live without escaping, which is more complicated than it sounds because snails are excellent climbers and can squeeze through gaps that seem physically impossible. You start by digging a shallow trench in a rectangular pattern, maybe 10 paces by 15 paces, and then you line the bottom with broken pottery shards because snails need calcium to build their shells and crushed ceramic provides exactly that. The trench is only about as deep as your forearm, and once it's dug you're going to fill it with a mixture of composted leaves, vegetable scraps and dark soil that you'll carry up from the riverbank in baskets over the course of several days. Your back is going to hurt. That's just part of the process. And there's something almost meditative about the repetitive physical labour, the way your mind can wander while your body does the same motion over and over again, the rhythm of bending and lifting and walking and dumping, becoming a kind of physical prayer to gods who probably aren't paying attention but might be. Around the perimeter of this trench you construct a low wall using stones that you gather from the surrounding hillside, each one roughly the size of a loaf of bread, and you fit them together without mortar because mortar is expensive and also because a dry stone wall is easier to modify if you realise you've made a mistake in the design, which you probably will because nobody really knows the optimal specifications for a snail enclosure. On top of this stone wall you're going to eventually install a barrier made from smooth wooden planks that have been treated with olive oil, creating a surface so slippery that snails can't climb over it. You learned this trick from Philon, who demonstrated it by placing a snail on an oiled board and watching it slide slowly backward despite its best efforts, its entire body rippling with what you can only describe as confusion and mild indignation. Snails, you're learning, have more personality than you'd expect from a creature without a face, and they seem to approach obstacles with a kind of methodical stubbornness that you're starting to respect. The whole construction process takes you about 2 weeks, working mostly in the early morning before the sun gets too aggressive and then again in the late afternoon when the heat finally breaks. During the middle of the day, you sit in the shade of an olive tree and eat bread and cheese and olives, and sometimes a little dried fish. And you think about whether this entire plan is completely insane or merely slightly insane, and you can't quite decide which option is more comforting. The bread is the dark, heavy kind made from barley flour that sits in your stomach like a small, satisfied rock, and the cheese is sharp and crumbly and probably made from goat's milk. And the combination of these simple foods feels like the most reasonable thing in your life right now, unlike the elaborate snail sanctuary you're constructing for creatures that most people consider garden pests at best. The wood for your snail barriers arrives on a cart pulled by an ox that looks deeply unimpressed with its life choices. And the man driving the cart is named Sostrates, who runs a lumber operation near the port and who has absolutely no idea why you need planks that have been planed smooth on both sides and cut to very specific lengths. You don't explain, because explaining would require admitting that you're building furniture for snails. And Sostrates already looks at you like you might be suffering from too much sun exposure, so there's no reason to confirm his suspicions. The planks are made from cypress wood, which is naturally resistant to rot and insect damage, and they cost more than you wanted to spend but less than you feared they might. And Sostrates helps you unload them in exchange for a cup of watered wine and some figs that you bought in the agora the previous day. He drinks the wine quickly, wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and leaves without asking any questions, which you appreciate because you're not sure you could answer them without sounding like you've lost your grip on reality. You spend the next 3 days fitting these planks to the top of your stone walls, using wooden pegs and leather straps to secure them because nails are expensive, and you're trying to keep costs reasonable, though reasonable is a relative term when you're investing this much time and effort into livestock that moves at a pace best measured with a sundial. The planks overlap slightly at the corners and you have to trim them with a saw that's probably older than you are, the blade dull enough that each cut requires genuine effort and leaves your arms trembling. There's something satisfying about the physical work though. The way you can see immediate progress, the way the enclosure gradually takes shape and starts to look like an actual intentional structure rather than a random pile of rocks and wood that happen to fall into a rectangular pattern. You coat each plank with olive oil using a rag made from an old tunic that had reached the point where wearing it in public would have been a social statement you weren't prepared to make, and the oil soaks into the wood grain and makes it gleam in the afternoon light, smooth and slippery and completely impassable to any snail with ambitions of escape. While you work, you think about Philon and the visit you paid him 2 weeks ago, walking for half a day through countryside that alternated between cultivated fields and wild scrubland where goats grazed on whatever they could find. Philon's snail farm was larger than you expected, a series of interconnected enclosures spread across terraced hillside, each one hosting a different stage of snail development, and the old man moved between them with the confidence of someone who had long ago stopped questioning his life choices and had simply accepted that he was now a person who had opinions about gastropod husbandry. He showed you his breeding stock, pointing out which snails had the best shell patterns and which ones grew fastest and which ones were, in his words, too stupid to be worth keeping, though he never explained how he determined the intelligence level of a snail. You suspected it had something to do with how quickly they learned to find food, but you didn't ask because Philon seemed to enjoy his air of mysterious expertise. He told you that the key to successful snail farming was consistency, that snails were creatures of habit who thrived on routine and predictable conditions, and that if you could create an environment where they felt safe and well fed, they would reproduce enthusiastically and grow to impressive sizes. He also warned you about the common mistakes that new farmers made, like overfeeding, which led to sick snails, or underwatering, which led to dormant snails, or providing inadequate calcium, which led to snails with thin, fragile shells that cracked easily, and made the creatures vulnerable to every bird and rodent in the vicinity. Philon had been farming snails for almost 30 years, and he spoke about them with a mixture of affection and exasperation that reminded you of how people talked about difficult relatives. And you left his farm with a basket full of breeding stock and a head full of information that you were definitely going to forget at least half of within the next week. The breeding stock cost you a small fortune, relatively speaking, but Philon assured you these were premium specimens from bloodlines that had been selected over multiple generations for size and flavour and shell quality. And you chose to believe him because the alternative was accepting that you'd just paid the equivalent of a month's wages for 24 snails that looked essentially identical to the ones you could find for free on any damp rock. They sat in your basket making quiet scraping sounds as they moved around, and you carried them home feeling like you were transporting something simultaneously precious and ridiculous, which was probably an accurate assessment of the situation. The day you introduce your breeding stock to their new home is overcast, which is perfect because it means you don't have to worry about the snails drying out during the transfer process. And there's something almost ceremonial about the way you carefully place each one into the enclosure, spacing them out across the prepared soil like you're planting very slow, very slimy seeds. The snails emerge from their shells cautiously, extending their heads and tentacles to investigate their surroundings, and you watch them with the kind of focused attention that you previously reserved for important things like making sure you didn't trip and fall off cliffs. They begin to explore, leaving silver trails of mucus across the dark earth, and within an hour most of them have found the patches of decomposing lettuce leaves that you scattered around the enclosure as a welcoming gift, and they're eating with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm, their mouths working steadily at the vegetation in a way that's almost hypnotic if you watch it long enough. Snails eat using a structure called a radula, which is essentially a tongue covered in thousands of tiny teeth, and they rasp away at their food in a grinding motion that's surprisingly effective despite looking like it shouldn't work at all. You learned this from Philon, who demonstrated by holding a snail up to his ear and claiming you could hear the eating sounds if you listened carefully enough. And you're still not entirely sure if he was being serious or messing with you, but you tried it anyway and heard something that might have been chewing or might have been your own pulse or might have been nothing at all. The point is that snails are more complex creatures than most people give them credit for, with actual teeth and simple brains and surprisingly sophisticated behaviors. And you're starting to understand why Philon talks about them the way he does, with that combination of scientific interest and genuine fondness. Your enclosure is now complete and inhabited, and you stand back to admire your work with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully completed a project that nobody asked for, and that serves a purpose that most people would consider questionable at best. The wooden barriers gleam with their coating of olive oil. The stone wall sits solid and level, and the soil inside is dark and rich in exactly the kind of environment that snails apparently find irresistible. You've installed several clay dishes filled with water, sunk partially into the ground so that snails can drink without risk of drowning, and you've created small shelters using curved pottery shards where snails can hide during the heat of the day. Because even though the enclosure is in partial shade, they still appreciate having options when it comes to avoiding direct sunlight. The watering system is going to be your biggest ongoing challenge, because snails need consistent moisture but not standing water. And the Mediterranean climate means you're fighting against natural conditions that want everything to be dry and hot, and generally inhospitable to creatures that are essentially mobile puddles of vulnerability. You've rigged up a simple irrigation system using a large ceramic jar with a small hole near the bottom, suspended above the enclosure so that water drips out slowly and creates a continuous gentle shower that keeps the soil damp without flooding it. The jar needs to be refilled every day, which means you're going to be walking back and forth from the nearest well with heavy containers of water, and your shoulders are already preparing their complaints. But this is the life you've chosen, and there's no point pretending it's going to be easy. You've also planted several varieties of herbs around the perimeter of the enclosure, things like fennel and mallow and wild lettuce that will eventually provide supplemental food for your snails, while also creating a microclimate that retains moisture and provides additional shade. Philon recommended this approach, explaining that snails fed on diverse vegetation developed more complex flavors that wealthy customers found appealing. And while you're not entirely sure how anyone can taste the difference between a snail that ate lettuce versus a snail that ate a combination of lettuce and fennel, you're willing to take his word for it because he's the expert. And you're just someone who decided 3 months ago that snail farming sounded like a reasonable career path. The first week of actual snail farming is less dramatic than you anticipated, which is probably appropriate given that your livestock moves at a speed that makes glaciers look impatient. You visit the enclosure twice daily, once in the early morning when the air is still cool and the dew makes everything glisten, and once in the evening after the sun has lost most of its aggressive energy and the light turns golden and forgiving. During these visits you check the water level in your irrigation jar, inspect the soil moisture with your fingers, remove any dead leaves or debris that might harbour unwanted pests, and count your snails to make sure none of them have figured out an escape route that you haven't anticipated. The counting process is more difficult than it should be because snails have a frustrating tendency to cluster together in groups, stacking themselves in little pyramids of shells that make individual identification nearly impossible, and also because they all look essentially the same to your untrained eye, so you're never quite certain whether you're counting the same snail twice or missing one entirely. You've started keeping records on a wax tablet, noting the daily temperature, the weather conditions, how much food you've provided, and any observations about snail behavior that seem potentially relevant. This is partly because Philon insisted that good record keeping was essential to successful farming, and partly because writing things down makes the whole enterprise feel more legitimate, like you're conducting serious agricultural research rather than just watching mollusks eat lettuce. Your handwriting is terrible because you never had much formal education, and most of what you learned about letters came from a few months spent as an assistant to a merchant who needed someone to help track inventory. But the words are readable enough that you can look back through previous days and see patterns emerging, like how the snails are more active on humid days and how they prefer wilted vegetables to fresh ones, which seems counterintuitive but apparently has something to do with how decomposition makes the plant matter easier to digest. The feeding routine takes more thought than you expected because snails are surprisingly picky eaters despite their reputation for consuming anything green and stationary. You've learned through trial and error that they particularly enjoy cabbage leaves that have been left out to wilt for a day, grape leaves that have fallen naturally from the vine, and the outer leaves of lettuce that would normally be thrown away as waste. They're less enthusiastic about fresh herbs, though they'll eat them if nothing else is available, and they completely ignore anything that's been salted, which makes sense given that salt is basically poison to creatures that are mostly water held together by slime and wishful thinking. You gather their food from various sources around the city, visiting the agora near closing time when merchants are willing to give away wilted produce rather than carry it home, and accepting vegetable scraps from neighbors who think your dedication to feeding something is admirable even if they're not entirely clear on what you're feeding. The snails themselves are beginning to display individual personalities, or at least variations in behavior that your brain is interpreting as personality, because humans are pattern-seeking creatures who will project consciousness onto literally anything that moves. There's one particularly large snail that always seems to be in motion, constantly exploring the enclosure boundaries like it's searching for structural weaknesses, and you've started calling it Odysseus in your head because it seems determined to find a way home even though this is its home now. Another snail, smaller and with a shell that has an unusual spiral pattern, spends most of its time near the water dishes and rarely ventures more than a handspan away from moisture, and you've named it Poseidon with the kind of humor that comes from spending too much time alone with invertebrates. You haven't told anyone about these names because explaining that you've developed an emotional attachment to specific snails would make the whole operation seem even more absurd than it already is, and you're trying to maintain at least a thin veneer of professional dignity. The neighbors have started to notice your project, mostly because you're spending several hours a day at a site that previously received no attention whatsoever, and also because you've been carrying large quantities of rotting vegetables through the olive grove, which isn't exactly subtle. A woman named Cleo, who lives in a small house about halfway between your enclosure and the city walls, stopped you yesterday to ask what you were doing, and you explained the concept of snail farming in the most matter-of-fact tone you could manage, like this was a completely normal agricultural pursuit that reasonable people engaged in all the time. She looked at you with an expression that suggested she was trying to determine whether you were joking or experiencing some kind of mental crisis, and then she laughed and said that her husband would probably pay good money for fresh snails because he'd developed expensive tastes during a trip to Rome and now considered himself too sophisticated for regular Greek food. You're not sure whether she was being serious or mocking you, but you told her to send him by in a few months when the snails had reached market size, and she nodded and walked away still laughing, which you're choosing to interpret as a positive sign of future business rather than a judgment on your life choices. By the third week, you've settled into a routine that feels almost sustainable, though sustainable is a word doing a lot of heavy lifting when you're spending 3 hours a day maintaining an enclosure for creatures that have no awareness of your sacrifice and no capacity for gratitude. The morning visits start just after dawn, when the light is still thin and grey and the air has that particular cool dampness that exists for maybe an hour before the Mediterranean sun remembers its job and starts aggressively evaporating every available water molecule. You check the irrigation jar first, topping it off from the large ceramic amphora that you keep nearby, filled from your daily trips to the communal well that's located an inconvenient distance away, and that requires you to wait in line behind people who always seem to have questions about why you need so much water for a plot of land that's not growing any visible crops. You've stopped explaining and now just shrug and say something vague about experimentation, which satisfies most people because the Greeks generally approve of experimentation even when they don't understand what's being experimented on. After watering, you distribute the food you prepared the previous evening, wilted leaves arranged in small piles throughout the enclosure so that snails don't have to travel far to eat. Not that traveling far is something snails are particularly enthusiastic about anyway. You've noticed that they have preferred feeding spots, certain areas of the enclosure where they consistently gather, and you've started placing more food in these locations because it seems cruel to make them work harder than necessary when they're already moving at a pace that makes trees look kinetic. The vegetables you're feeding them today include cabbage leaves from a merchant who was grateful to have someone take them away, some lettuce that had gone limp in someone's kitchen, and a handful of grape leaves that you collected from Cleomenes' vineyard, where he started leaving buckets of trimmings near the path because he's figured out that you'll take them and it saves him the trouble of composting them properly. The snails emerge from various hiding spots as soon as the food appears, which suggests they can somehow smell or sense fresh vegetables even though they don't have noses in any conventional sense, and their sensory organs are located on the tips of their tentacles in an arrangement that seems inefficient but apparently works fine for their purposes. They converge on the food piles in slow motion, leaving trails of mucus that catch the morning light and create an abstract pattern across the dark soil, like silver threads connecting various points in a very gradual textile project. You watch them eat for longer than is probably necessary, but there's something meditative about the process. The way they rasp methodically at the leaves, the way they sometimes bump into each other and have to negotiate who gets access to which piece of cabbage. These negotiations conducted entirely through the language of slowly pushing against each other until one of them gives up and moves to a different feeding spot. You've started to understand what Philon meant about consistency being important, because the snails respond visibly to routine, becoming more active and more willing to emerge from their shells when they learn that food appears at predictable times and that their environment maintains stable conditions. The ones that were initially shy and spent most of their time hidden under pottery shards are now confidently exploring during feeding times, and you can see that they've grown slightly, their shells developing new growth rings that appear as subtle variations in color along the spiral. Growth is slow, obviously, because everything about snails is slow, but it's measurable and consistent, and there's satisfaction in seeing tangible results from your efforts, even if those results are happening at a pace that requires patience you didn't know you possessed. The afternoon visits are shorter and mostly involve checking that nothing has gone catastrophically wrong during the day, that no predators have found a way into the enclosure, that the water system is still functioning, that the sun hasn't somehow defeated your shade structures and baked everything into a crispy disaster. Occasionally you find evidence of birds having perched on the wooden barriers, eyeing the snails with interest but unable to reach them, and you feel a small sense of victory at having successfully protected your livestock from threats they're too slow to escape on their own. Once you found a snake in the enclosure, a small one that had presumably squeezed through some gap you hadn't noticed, and you removed it with a stick while apologizing to the snake for denying it an easy meal, because you're developing the kind of relationship with animals where you feel the need to explain your actions to them even though they definitely don't care about your reasoning. The first real crisis arrives during the 4th week in the form of a heat wave that settles over Athens like a punishment from angry gods who have decided that the mortals below need a reminder about their place in the cosmic order. The temperature climbs to levels where even the lizards that normally bask on rocks start looking for shade, and the air becomes thick and still in a way that makes breathing feel like work. You notice the change immediately during your morning visit when you find several snails sealed into their shells with those mucus doors that signal they've gone dormant, a response to conditions they've determined are too dangerous for remaining active. This is exactly what you were trying to avoid, and you stand there in the early heat looking at these sealed shells and feeling like you've somehow failed a test you didn't know you were taking, even though the weather is objectively not your fault and there's no way you could have prevented a heat wave through better enclosure management. You spend the rest of the morning trying to counteract the temperature increase through every method you can think of, starting with soaking the soil thoroughly until it's muddy and waterlogged in a way that Philon would probably disapprove of, but desperate times call for desperate measures. You drape damp cloth over sections of the enclosure to create additional shade and increase humidity, using old fabric that's too worn for clothing but still serviceable for snail climate control. And you refill the irrigation jar 3 times in rapid succession, something you've never done before because it feels wasteful. But right now, waste is less concerning than watching your entire breeding stock decide to hibernate through the summer. The damp cloth creates a cave-like environment in parts of the enclosure, dim and cool and dripping with moisture, and you check it obsessively throughout the day, returning every hour or so to make sure the fabric hasn't dried out and to adjust its position to maximize shade coverage. By evening, some of the sealed snails have reopened, emerging cautiously like soldiers checking whether the battle is still happening before committing to leaving their fortifications. Others remain closed, little fortresses of shell and dried mucus that give no indication of whether the occupants are still alive or have decided this whole being alive thing wasn't worth the effort. You can't tell if a sealed snail is dormant or dead without breaking the seal, and breaking the seal on a dormant snail can kill it, so you're stuck in a state of uncertainty that's probably character building but feels mostly just stressful. Philon warned you about this, explaining that summer dormancy was one of the biggest challenges in snail farming, and that the key was preventing it before it started rather than trying to reverse it afterward. Advice that's extremely helpful now that it's too late to implement it properly. You spend that night lying awake in your small rented room in the city, listening to the sounds of neighbors arguing through thin walls and thinking about snails sealed in their shells in the darkness of the grove, wondering if you've just watched several weeks of work and investment disappear because you underestimated the importance of temperature control. The room is hot despite the open window, and there's no breeze, just still air that feels like it's been breathed too many times by too many people, and you eventually give up on sleep and walk back to the enclosure under starlight, carrying water and more damp cloth, because doing something feels better than lying in the dark imagining failure. The grove at night is a different place, full of sounds that you don't hear during the day, insects clicking and chirping in rhythms that seem to have meaning even though you don't understand the language, and somewhere in the distance an owl is announcing its presence to whatever small creatures might be considering an evening stroll. You work by moonlight, which is surprisingly adequate once your eyes adjust, soaking the cloth again and adjusting the irrigation jar and generally fussing over the enclosure like a worried parent checking on a sick child. The snails that are active move slowly through patches of moonlight, their shells catching and reflecting the pale illumination, and you count 12 that are definitely moving and at least 8 that are sealed, and several more that you can't locate at all, which means they're either hiding very effectively or have somehow escaped despite your supposedly snail-proof barriers, and you're too tired to investigate which possibility is more likely. You return to the city as dawn starts to lighten the eastern sky, and you sleep for maybe 2 hours before the heat wakes you again, and you get up and start the whole routine over, checking water, adjusting shade, counting snails, and trying to project an air of competence and control despite having no idea whether anything you're doing is actually helping. This is farming, you're learning, this cycle of action and uncertainty, and hoping that your interventions are beneficial rather than harmful. And it's entirely possible that the Greeks who chose to grow olives and grapes had the right idea all along, because at least olive trees don't seal themselves into dormancy when the weather gets inconvenient. The heat wave breaks after 5 days that feel like 5 years, and the change comes with an evening thunderstorm that rolls in from the sea with dramatic clouds and distant lightning and rain that falls in heavy drops that smell like minerals and promise. You're at the enclosure when it starts, and you stand there getting soaked while watching the rain transform the dusty soil into dark mud and fill every depression with small temporary pools. And the relief is almost physical, like you can feel the temperature dropping with each passing minute. The snails respond immediately, the sealed ones beginning to open within hours, emerging from dormancy like actors who had been waiting off stage for their cue. And by the next morning all but 2 have reopened and resumed normal activity, eating with what appears to be enthusiasm after their enforced fast. The 2 that remain sealed are probably dead, which is unfortunate but not catastrophic, a mortality rate of roughly 8% from your breeding stock. And Philon had told you to expect losses in the first year as you learned the particular requirements of your specific site and climate. You leave the sealed shells in place for now because there's a chance they're just being extra cautious and might reopen in a few more days, and also because removing them would require admitting defeat and you're not quite ready for that level of acceptance. The snails that survived the heat wave seem larger somehow, though this might be your imagination or wishful thinking. the human tendency to see positive outcomes even in situations that were mostly just stressful and difficult. The storm has done more than just break the heatwave, though. It's also brought a flush of new growth to the herbs and grasses around the enclosure, and within days there's fresh green vegetation sprouting everywhere. And the snails are eating this in addition to the wilted vegetables you provide, and you make notes about how they seem to prefer certain wild plants over others, showing particular enthusiasm for young mallow leaves and a kind of chickweed that grows in damp, shady spots. This is useful information, the kind of observation that you can't find in any written source because nobody has bothered to write a comprehensive manual about snail preferences, and you're essentially conducting original research through trial and error and careful attention to which food items disappear fastest. You've started to notice patterns in snail behavior that you're not sure are real or just products of your pattern-seeking brain imposing order on random activity. The snails seem to be more active during and immediately after rain, which makes sense given their moisture requirements, and they appear to follow each other's slime trails, creating highways of mucus that connect popular feeding areas to popular resting spots. Whether they're actually following the trails intentionally or just happen to be traveling the same routes because those routes represent the most logical paths through the enclosure is unclear. But you've started thinking of these trails as snail infrastructure, a transportation network that they maintain and update through constant use. And this probably says something about your mental state, but you're too invested in the observation to worry about the implications. Cleomenes stops by one afternoon, ostensibly to check on his olive trees, but really to see what you've been doing with the rocky patch of land that he probably assumed would remain forever useless. He peers into the enclosure with the expression of someone trying to understand a foreign custom that seems absurd but might contain hidden wisdom, and he asks how the snails are doing in a tone that's carefully neutral, and you explain the recent heatwave crisis and recovery in more detail than he probably wanted to hear. He nods slowly and says that farming is always a battle against weather, and that anyone who works with living things is essentially gambling against forces they can't control. And this is either profound wisdom or stating the obvious, but you appreciate the sentiment because it makes your recent stress feel like part of a larger tradition of agricultural anxiety rather than evidence of personal incompetence. He tells you that his olive harvest was poor last year because of irregular rainfall, and that his grapevines are struggling with some kind of fungal infection that appeared after a particularly humid spring, and you realize that he's trying to make you feel better by sharing his own problems, which is kind of him, even though comparing grape fungus to snail dormancy feels like comparing completely different categories of agricultural disaster. Still, there's comfort in the commiseration, in being reminded that farming of any kind involves constant problem-solving and adaptation, and that everyone who grows things for a living spends a significant portion of their time worrying about factors beyond their control while pretending to have confidence and expertise they don't really possess. By the 6th week, you've developed a relationship with the local well that can only be described as complicated, which is what happens when you have to visit the same location twice daily carrying heavy ceramic vessels that slosh water down your tunic and make you smell perpetually damp in a way that's probably not attractive but has become so normal you've stopped noticing. The well is located in a small square where several streets converge, and it's become a social hub in the way that shared water sources always do. A place where people gather and talk and exchange gossip while ostensibly just collecting water for practical household purposes. You've become a familiar figure there, the person who always needs more water than seems reasonable and who never quite explains what it's for, and the regular well visitors have started to develop theories about your activities that range from reasonably accurate to wildly creative. There's an old woman named Thea who's convinced you're growing some kind of exotic plant that requires constant irrigation, and she's asked you multiple times what kind of plant it is and whether it produces valuable dyes or medicines, and you've been vague in your responses because explaining that you're growing snails seems like it would lead to more questions than you're prepared to answer. There's a young man named Alexios who thinks you're involved in some kind of secret religious cult that requires ritual washing, and he watches you with a combination of suspicion and fascination that suggests he's torn between reporting you to someone official and asking if he can join. And there's a middle-aged merchant named Damon, who seems to have correctly guessed that you're doing something agricultural but hasn't figured out exactly what, and he asks leading questions about crop yields and market prices while you fill your vessels and try to change the subject to safer topics like weather and local politics. The water carrying itself has become a meditative exercise in the same way that any repetitive physical task eventually becomes meditative if you do it enough times, and you've developed a particular rhythm for the walk from well to enclosure, a pace that minimizes sloshing while maintaining enough speed that the trip doesn't consume your entire day. Your shoulders have developed muscles in places you didn't know could develop muscles, and your hands have calluses from the vessel handles, and there's something satisfying about these physical changes even though they're evidence of labor that most people would consider beneath them. The Greeks have complicated feelings about manual work, respecting it in theory while generally preferring that other people do it in practice, but you've found that there's genuine satisfaction in physical competence, in becoming stronger and more efficient at a task through simple repetition and adaptation. The route from well to enclosure takes you through parts of the city that you're becoming intimately familiar with, past the same workshop where the same bronze smith hammers the same rhythmic patterns every morning, past the small shrine to Hermes where someone leaves fresh flowers with impressive consistency, past the house where an unseen person practices the flute with more enthusiasm than skill, creating melodies that are technically correct but emotionally unconvincing in a way that's almost endearing. You've started to measure time by these landmarks, knowing that if you hear the bronze smith working then you're running on schedule, knowing that if the flowers at the shrine are wilted then you're later than usual, knowing that if the flute player has moved on to a new song then it's probably late afternoon and you should hurry. The snails remain blissfully unaware of the logistical complications their hydration requirements create, and they continue eating and growing and occasionally engaging in reproductive activities that you try not to watch too closely, because there's something voyeuristic about monitoring the intimate lives of livestock, even when those livestock are just gastropods following biological imperatives without any concept of privacy or dignity. You've noticed that they seem to prefer mating during evening hours when the temperature is cooled and humidity is higher, and they conduct these encounters with the same methodical slowness that characterizes every other snail activity, taking what seems like hours to complete a process that more energetic creatures accomplish in minutes. Philon had told you that snails are hermaphrodites, meaning each individual has both male and female reproductive organs, and that any two snails can potentially mate and both produce eggs, which seems like an efficient system from a biological standpoint but creates complications for tracking lineage if you ever cared about that, which you probably should but currently don't. The actual egg-laying happens underground, with snails digging small holes in the soft soil and depositing clusters of tiny round eggs that look like translucent pearls, and you only know this is happening because you occasionally find these holes during your maintenance work, carefully covered over by the parent snail in a display of maternal instinct that seems touching, until you remember that the snail will immediately forget about the eggs and probably eat its own offspring if given the opportunity. Nature is full of these uncomfortable contradictions, behaviors that seem caring or thoughtful but are really just automatic responses programmed by evolution. And you're learning not to project too much emotion onto creatures that are essentially biological machines running very simple software. The eggs take about 2 weeks to hatch depending on temperature and humidity, and the baby snails that emerge are almost impossibly small, their shells no bigger than grains of wheat, translucent and fragile and vulnerable to basically everything. You discover your first batch of hatchlings by accident during a routine inspection, finding a cluster of tiny snails moving slowly across a damp patch of soil near one of the water dishes, and you spend several minutes just watching them because there's something mesmerizing about creatures at this scale. The way they move with the same methodical determination as their parents, despite being small enough that a strong breeze could probably kill them. These are the first snails actually born in your enclosure as opposed to imported from Philon's stock, and there's a sense of achievement in seeing this happen, in knowing that you've successfully created conditions where snails feel comfortable enough to reproduce, even if comfortable is probably not a word that applies to snail consciousness in any meaningful way. You start finding more hatchlings over the next few days as other eggs reach maturity, and you make rough counts that suggest you have somewhere between 50 and 80 baby snails in various stages of early development, though counting them accurately is nearly impossible because they're small enough to hide under individual grains of soil and because they blend almost perfectly with their environment. Their shells still undeveloped and pale and lacking the distinctive spiral pattern that makes adult snails relatively easy to spot. Philon had warned you that juvenile mortality would be high, that maybe only 10 or 20% of hatchlings would survive to adulthood under the best conditions, and that your job was to maximize that percentage through careful management and protection from predators. Though protecting something the size of a grain of wheat from predators felt like a task designed to teach you humility more than anything else. The baby snails need different food than the adults, softer vegetation that's easier for their tiny radulas to process, and you start providing things like overripe fruit mashed into paste and lettuce leaves that have decomposed to the point where they're barely holding together as solid matter. The adults ignore this baby food most of the time, preferring their usual diet of wilted but still structurally intact vegetables, and you're now maintaining 2 separate feeding programs within the same enclosure, trying to make sure everyone has access to age-appropriate nutrition, which is probably more thought than most people put into feeding their actual children, but these snails represent your investment and your future income, so careful attention seems justified. You've also started adding crushed eggshells to the enclosure as an additional calcium source, collecting them from neighbors and from the food vendors in the agora who are happy to give you buckets of shells they would otherwise throw away. The eggshells get crushed with a stone until they're powder, and then scattered across the soil, and the snails eat this powder enthusiastically, especially the juveniles who need calcium for shell development more urgently than the adults do. Watching baby snails eat calcium powder is not something you expected to spend time doing when you first moved to Athens, but here you are and you've learned to find satisfaction in unexpected places, including the observation of juvenile gastropod dietary habits. The work has settled into a pattern that feels sustainable at least for now, a rhythm of morning and evening visits, water carrying, food preparation, observation, and note-taking that fills your days with purpose even if that purpose is objectively strange. You've stopped worrying quite so much about whether this entire venture is insane, and have started focusing on the practical details of making it successful, which is probably a healthier mindset even if it means you've accepted that you're now definitively a person whose life revolves around snail welfare. Cleo stopped by again last week with her husband Nikias, who did indeed want to talk about purchasing snails once they reached market size, and who offered you a price that was higher than you expected, suggesting that Philon wasn't exaggerating about the profit potential of this business. Assuming you can keep enough snails alive to actually have something to sell, Nikias explained that he'd developed a taste for snails prepared in the Roman style during his travels, cooked with wine and herbs and served as a delicacy at dinner parties where people with disposable income gathered to eat expensive food and have philosophical discussions about topics they didn't understand. And he wanted a reliable local source because importing them from Italy was expensive and unpredictable. You told him you'd have snails available in about 3 months, which was probably optimistic but seemed like the kind of confident projection that business people make. And he nodded and said he'd tell his friends. And suddenly you had the beginning of a customer base. which made the whole operation feel more real and less like an extended experiment in whether you could successfully maintain moisture levels in a rectangular patch of dirt. The 7th week brings a visitor you weren't expecting. An older man with the kind of weathered face that suggests decades spent outdoors making decisions about crops and livestock. And he introduces himself as Dioklos, a snail farmer from Corinth who heard about your operation through some friend of a friend network that apparently exists among people who have decided to dedicate their lives to gastropod husbandry. He's traveled for 2 days specifically to see what you're doing, which feels flattering and slightly alarming in equal measure because it suggests your reputation has spread beyond your immediate area, and reputations can be positive or negative, and you're not entirely sure which direction yours is heading. Dioklos walks around your enclosure with the critical eye of someone evaluating a piece of equipment they're considering purchasing, and he makes small humming noises that could indicate approval or concern, and you stand there trying to project confidence while internally cataloguing all the things that are probably wrong with your setup. After a thorough inspection that feels like it lasts several hours but probably only takes 20 minutes, Dioklos pronounces your operation surprisingly competent for a first-year farmer, which is both a compliment and a reminder that you're still very much an amateur in a field that apparently has standards and expectations you only partially understand. He points out several improvements you could make, starting with the fact that your wooden barriers should be higher because larger snails can sometimes stack on top of each other and create living towers that reach heights you wouldn't think possible, and he's seen escapes happen this way more times than he cares to remember. He also suggests that you should create multiple smaller enclosures rather than one large one, because it allows for better management of different age groups and makes it easier to isolate sick snails before they infect the entire population. And you nod and take mental notes while wondering how you're going to find the time and resources to restructure everything you've just spent 2 months building. Dioklos tells you stories about his own early failures, including the time he lost an entire breeding stock to a particularly clever rat that figured out how to climb down into his enclosure from an overhanging tree branch, and the time he accidentally poisoned half his snails by feeding them cabbage that had been grown in soil contaminated with something toxic, possibly copper from a nearby workshop, and the time he spent 3 weeks nursing sick snails back to health only to discover that they were sick because he'd been overfeeding them and they basically had the snail equivalent of indigestion. These stories are presumably meant to make you feel better about your own struggles, and they do help a little, providing perspective that everyone who does this work encounters problems, and that survival is often just a matter of making slightly fewer mistakes than fatal ones. He's particularly interested in your juvenile snails, the ones that hatch from eggs laid by your breeding stock, and he crouches down to examine them with the kind of focused attention that suggests he can see details you're missing. He tells you that the hatchling survival rate looks good based on his experience, that you're probably going to end up with 25 or 30 juveniles that make it to market size, which is better than average for a first breeding cycle, and this assessment makes you feel unreasonably proud considering that your contribution to their survival has mostly just been keeping things damp and hoping for the best. Dioklos explains that the key to maximizing juvenile survival is providing abundant food sources so they don't have to compete with adults, and making sure there are plenty of hiding spots where small snails can escape the attention of birds and insects that view them as convenient snacks. Before he leaves, Dioklos gives you a small ceramic jar containing what he describes as his secret weapon for snail farming, a mixture of ground grains and herbs that he feeds to his breeding stock and that he swears produces larger, healthier snails with better tasting meat. The recipe is supposedly a family secret that his grandfather developed through decades of experimentation, and he's sharing it with you because he believes in helping new farmers and because the Greek snail farming community is small enough that cooperation makes more sense than competition, at least until you're both rich enough that competition becomes more appealing than cooperation. The mixture smells earthy and slightly sweet, and you have no idea if it actually does anything or if this is just experienced farmer superstition, but you accept it gratefully and promise to report back on results. And Dioklos nods and begins his journey back to Corinth, leaving you with new information, new anxieties, and a jar of mysterious grain mixture. That evening you try the special feed mixture, sprinkling it across the enclosure and watching to see if the snails react differently to it than they do to regular food. And they seem enthusiastic, but then again they seem enthusiastic about most food, so it's hard to tell if this is a meaningful response or just normal snail behavior. You make a note on your wax tablet about the date you started using Dioklos's mixture so you can track any changes in growth rate or health, and you realize that you're now maintaining multiple experimental variables, and that your record-keeping system is becoming more sophisticated than you ever intended, evolving from simple daily observations into something approaching actual agricultural research, which is either impressive or a sign that you've become too invested in what was supposed to be a straightforward business venture.
The 8th week coincides with a local festival dedicated to Demeter, goddess of harvest and agriculture, and the city fills with people who have travelled from surrounding villages to participate in the celebrations, which involve processions and sacrifices, and a lot of bread made from the new grain harvest, and distributed to anyone who shows up and looks hungry. You attend the festival partly because it seems like the socially appropriate thing to do, and partly because festivals mean people are in good moods, and might be more receptive to hearing about innovative agricultural projects like snail farming, though you're careful about how you phrase this, because announcing that you raise snails for food tends to generate reactions ranging from curiosity to mild disgust with not much middle ground. The festival atmosphere is chaotic and joyful in the way that religious celebrations tend to be when they're more about community gathering and actual religious devotion, and you find yourself swept along in crowds of people moving between various ceremonial sites and market stalls, and impromptu performances by musicians who are varying degrees of talented. You encounter Nikias at the festival, and he's accompanied by several friends who he introduces as potential customers, men with well-made tunics and hands that look like they've never done manual labour, the kind of people who can afford to care about the specific provenance and preparation of their food. They ask questions about your snails with the enthusiasm of people who have discovered a new topic to have opinions about, and you find yourself explaining your feeding methods and growth rates and projected harvest dates with more confidence than you necessarily feel. But confidence is part of selling anything, and these men seem to respond well to certainty, even when that certainty is partially performative. One of them, a man named Philippos, who apparently made his money importing pottery from Corinth, asks whether your snails are fed on wild herbs or cultivated vegetables, and you explain that it's a combination of both, which seems to satisfy him because apparently snails that eat diverse diets are considered superior, though you're not entirely sure how anyone could taste the difference. The conversation turns to cooking methods, and the men debate the merits of various recipes with the seriousness that wealthy people bring to topics that don't actually matter very much in the grand scheme of things, but that serve as markers of cultural sophistication and social status. Someone mentions a Roman recipe that involves cooking snails in their shells with a mixture of wine, garum, and various herbs, and someone else insists that the proper Greek method is to remove the snails from their shells first, and cook them in a sauce made from olive oil and vinegar and crushed coriander seeds. And the debate becomes heated in a friendly way that suggests these men have had this argument before and enjoy having it again. You listen and make mental notes about what your future customers expect, understanding that selling snails isn't just about producing the animals themselves, but about understanding the cultural context in which they'll be consumed, the stories and preferences and prejudices that turn a simple protein source into a status symbol. Philippos asks when you'll have snails available for purchase, and you tell him approximately 10 weeks, which is a more conservative estimate than you gave Nikias, because you're learning to underpromise and overdeliver rather than the reverse. And Philippos nods and says he'll host a dinner party specifically to showcase your snails if they're as good as Nikias claims they'll be. This feels like significant pressure, the idea that your snails will be evaluated by a room full of wealthy men who have nothing better to do than judge food preparation and assign social meaning to culinary choices, but it's also an opportunity for word-of-mouth marketing that could establish your reputation among exactly the demographic that's willing to pay premium prices for what most people consider garden pests. You accept the implicit challenge and promise to deliver the best snails possible, and Philippos smiles and offers to pay in advance, which you decline because accepting money before you've delivered product seems like tempting fate, though you appreciate the gesture. The festival continues into the evening with torchlit processions and singing that gets progressively less coordinated as wine consumption increases, and you eventually extract yourself from the crowds and walk back through darkened streets toward your room, thinking about the gap between where you are now and where you need to be in 10 weeks. Your snails need to grow larger, need to remain healthy, need to develop the qualities that will make wealthy men want to eat them, and tell their friends about the experience. This is the gamble of farming, investing time and effort into living things that might thrive or might die, or might simply remain disappointingly mediocre, and you won't know which outcome you've achieved until it's too late to change course. The thought should be anxiety-inducing, but instead feels almost energizing. The challenge of trying to guide biological processes toward desired outcomes using nothing but observation and adjustment, and the accumulated wisdom of people like Phalon and Diocles, who figured some of this out before you and were generous enough to share. The 9th week introduces you to one of the less glamorous aspects of snail farming that nobody mentioned during your initial research phase, which is that snails produce a surprising amount of waste for creatures their size, and this waste needs to be managed or the enclosure becomes a health hazard that attracts flies and creates smells that are detectable from an unfortunate distance. You discover this problem gradually, noticing first that certain areas of the enclosure have started to develop a distinctive odor, and then realizing that the soil in these areas has become darker and more compact, saturated with snail feces and uneaten food that's decomposing in ways that are probably creating bacterial conditions you'd rather not think about too closely. Cleaning the enclosure becomes a new addition to your routine, a process that involves carefully removing the top layer of soil from affected areas and replacing it with fresh earth carried up from the riverbank, trying not to disturb the snails themselves, who seem mildly annoyed by the disruption, but not annoyed enough to actually move out of the way while you work around them. The waste material you remove isn't completely useless, it turns out, because decomposed snail droppings mixed with old food scraps and soil creates a type of compost that Cleomenes is happy to take for his olive trees, claiming it's rich in nutrients and makes excellent fertilizer, though you suspect he's partly just being kind and giving you a socially acceptable way to dispose of material that would otherwise be a problem. You start delivering baskets of this compost to him weekly, and he accepts them with the grave seriousness of someone receiving tribute, and in return he continues to provide grape leaves and prunings and occasionally some wine that's slightly too sour for comfortable drinking, but perfectly adequate for cooking, or for offering to visitors who you don't particularly want to impress. This informal exchange economy feels natural in a way that pure monetary transactions don't, a reminder that the Greeks have always preferred gift-based relationships over impersonal market interactions when dealing with neighbors and acquaintances. The cleaning process also gives you an opportunity to inspect individual snails more closely, checking for signs of disease or injury or parasites that might indicate problems requiring intervention. You've learned to recognize healthy snails by their shell appearance and behavior patterns, the way they move confidently and eat enthusiastically, and generally seem engaged with their environment in whatever limited way snail consciousness allows for engagement. Unhealthy snails tend to be sluggish even by snail standards, and their shells often show discoloration or unusual texture, and they hide more than average and eat less than they should. And when you find snails displaying these symptoms, you isolate them in a separate small container to prevent potential disease spread, though you're not entirely sure what diseases snails can get or how they spread, because this information doesn't seem to exist in any accessible written form. One snail in particular concerns you, a medium-sized individual with a shell that's developed a crack along one of the spiral ridges, and you can't tell if this crack resulted from physical trauma or calcium deficiency or some kind of shell disease you've never heard of. The snail itself seems relatively normal in behavior, still eating and moving at standard snail pace, but the crack is definitely getting larger over the course of several days, and you worry that it might eventually compromise the shell's structural integrity and leave the snail vulnerable to dehydration or predation or whatever other dangers affect mollusks with damaged protective housing. You try treating it by providing extra calcium in the form of powdered eggshell mixed with a tiny amount of honey to make it stick to the affected area, a remedy you completely made up based on the logic that calcium builds shells and honey is antibacterial and sticky. And whether this treatment does anything useful or just makes you feel like you're taking action is impossible to determine, but the snail doesn't die immediately, so you count it as a tentative success. Philin visits during this week, making his first trip to see your operation since you purchased the breeding stock, and he walks around the enclosure nodding in a way that suggests approval mixed with the kind of critical assessment that experienced people bring to evaluating the work of novices. He points out that your barriers need reinforcement, which you already knew from Dioclase, and that your water distribution system could be improved by adding multiple drip points instead of relying on a single irrigation jar, creating more even moisture distribution across the enclosure. He also notices things you missed, like how certain areas never seem to have snails in them and how this might indicate drainage problems or soil composition issues, or possibly just random snail preference for reasons that defy human understanding. Philin has that quality common to people who have spent decades working with living things, an ability to see patterns and problems that aren't obvious to untrained observers, and you follow him around taking mental notes while he provides a running commentary on your operation that's part encouragement and part gentle criticism. He's particularly impressed by the juvenile snails, examining several of them closely, and pronouncing them healthy and well-developed for their age, which makes you feel proud in a way that's probably disproportionate to the achievement of keeping baby snails alive. But you accept the pride anyway because farming is largely a series of small victories punctuated by occasional disasters, and you need to celebrate the victories when they occur.
Dagar en del by lopen high vannacht dat verdoof belevd slap je heavy bum hitting overleffing boy you just say you've had some ball houses and growth trauma. You can't tell if this crack resulted from physical trauma or calcium deficiency or some kind of shell disease you've never heard of. The snail itself seems relatively normal in behaviour, still eating and moving at standard snail pace, but the crack is definitely getting larger over the course of several days, and you worry that it might eventually compromise the shell's structural integrity and leave the snail vulnerable to dehydration or predation or whatever other dangers affect mollusks with damaged protective housing. You try treating it by providing extra calcium in the form of powdered eggshell mixed with a tiny amount of honey to make it stick to the affected area, a remedy you completely made up based on the logic that calcium builds shells and honey is antibacterial and sticky, and whether this treatment does anything useful or just makes you feel like you're taking action is impossible to determine, but the snail doesn't die immediately, so you count it as a tentative success. Philin visits during this week, making his first trip to see your operation since you purchased the breeding stock, and he walks around the enclosure nodding in a way that suggests approval mixed with the kind of critical assessment that experienced people bring to evaluating the work of novices. He points out that your barriers need reinforcement, which you already knew from Dioclase, and that your water distribution system could be improved by adding multiple drip points instead of relying on a single irrigation jar, creating more even moisture distribution across the enclosure. He also notices things you missed, like how certain areas never seem to have snails in them and how this might indicate drainage problems or soil composition issues or possibly just random snail preference for reasons that defy human understanding. Philin has that quality common to people who have spent decades working with living things, an ability to see patterns and problems that aren't obvious to untrained observers, and you follow him around taking mental notes while he provides a running commentary on your operation that's part encouragement and part gentle criticism. He's particularly impressed by the juvenile snails, examining several of them closely and pronouncing them healthy and well-developed for their age, which makes you feel proud in a way that's probably disproportionate to the achievement of keeping baby snails alive, but you accept the pride anyway because farming is largely a series of small victories punctuated by occasional disasters, and you need to celebrate the victories when they occur. The excellent Freddie Robert cheating this like time now makes skill children protection for failed facilities for calibration for the statistics growth measurements to specific snails you've started tracking individually by marking their shells with tiny dots of plant-based dye and notes about behavioural patterns that might indicate broader trends in the population. This level of documentation seems excessive for what's essentially a small-scale operation producing luxury food items, but you've discovered that you enjoy the process of systematic observation and recording, the way it forces you to pay attention to details you might otherwise miss, and the way it creates a written history of your project that might be useful for future reference or for other people who decide to attempt snail farming and want to learn from someone else's experience. Philin had mentioned that detailed records were valuable, that they allowed you to identify patterns and make better predictions about when problems might occur, and you're starting to understand what he meant as you notice correlations between weather conditions and snail behaviour that wouldn't be obvious without consistent documentation over time.
The 11th week brings your first serious predator problem in the form of a rat that discovers your enclosure and decides that snails represent an excellent food source that requires minimal effort to obtain, and you find evidence of its visits in the form of broken shells scattered near the wooden barriers and a general reduction in your snail population that you initially attribute to counting errors before realizing that something is actively hunting your livestock. Rats are clever and persistent, which are admirable qualities in the abstract, but deeply frustrating when applied to eating your business investment, and you spend several nights trying to catch the culprit using a trap made from a ceramic jar propped up with a stick and baited with cheese, a design that seems like it should work based on pure logic, but that the rat completely ignores, because apparently it prefers fresh snails to fermented milk products, and has enough intelligence to recognize obvious traps. You eventually catch the rat by accident rather than design, arriving at the enclosure early one morning and finding it still inside, too busy eating a particularly large snail to notice your approach, and you dispatch it quickly with a shovel in a moment that feels more like agricultural necessity than violence, even though the result is definitely a dead rat that you now need to dispose of. The experience leaves you feeling complicated emotions about the nature of farming and the way that maintaining one type of life often requires ending other types of life. And you wonder if people who grow plants instead of animals have an easier time with these ethical considerations, though you suspect that gardeners probably have their own versions of this problem involving insects and rabbits and birds that want to eat the crops. You bury the rat at the edge of the grove in a spot where it won't contaminate anything important, and you reinforce the barriers with additional planks that extend further down into the soil to prevent burrowing, and you spend the next several days checking obsessively for signs of additional predators. The rat managed to eat or damage approximately 15 snails before you stopped it, which represents a significant but not catastrophic loss to your population, and you're grateful that you discovered the problem when you did rather than letting it continue for weeks and returning to find your enclosure empty except for shells. The surviving snails seem unbothered by the death of their companions, continuing to eat and move and engage in mating activities with the same methodical focus they always display, and you're reminded that snails don't have the cognitive capacity for grief or fear or awareness that they're part of a population that's being slowly harvested by predators. This emotional simplicity is probably an advantage from the snail's perspective, allowing them to focus entirely on immediate survival needs without the burden of anxiety about future possibilities, and you find yourself slightly envious of their straightforward existence even as you work to protect them from dangers they can't comprehend. Cleo stops by during this week with a basket of bread and olives, claiming she was walking past and thought you might be hungry, though the real reason for her visit becomes clear when she asks detailed questions about your operation, and mentions that her cousin in Thebes is thinking about starting a snail farm and wants advice. You're not entirely sure how your reputation has spread as far as Thebes, but apparently the network of people interested in alternative agricultural ventures is more extensive than you realized, and you find yourself in the strange position of being considered an expert based on a few months of experience and a survival rate that's probably more luck than skill. You share what you've learned with Cleo, explaining the importance of moisture management and calcium supplementation and predator protection, and she takes notes on a wax tablet she brought specifically for this purpose, and you realize that knowledge sharing is creating informal networks of innovation that operate outside official institutions and traditional master-apprentice relationships. The conversation shifts to business matters, and Cleo asks what you're charging for your snails when they reach market size, and you quote the price that Nikias agreed to, and she nods and says that seems reasonable, but that you could probably charge more given the scarcity of local producers and the growing demand among wealthy Greeks who have adopted Roman culinary preferences. She suggests that you should think about expanding your operation, maybe leasing additional land and building more enclosures, scaling up production to meet demand that apparently exists in quantities larger than you realized. The advice is sound from a pure business perspective, but expansion would require capital you don't have and time you're already struggling to find. And there's also the question of whether you actually want to become a large-scale snail farmer, or whether this current scale represents the maximum level of commitment you're willing to make to gastropod husbandry. These are questions without obvious answers, and you tell Cleo you'll think about expansion once you've successfully completed your first full production cycle, and actually sold snails to customers who might or might not be satisfied with the quality. She accepts this answer and shares the bread and olives, and you sit together in the shade of the olive trees eating and talking about nothing particularly important, and there's something pleasant about this simple social interaction that doesn't require you to be teaching or learning or solving problems, just existing in shared space with another person who's decided that you're worth spending time with despite your unusual career choices.
The 12th week marks the midpoint of your projected timeline to having market-ready snails, and you conduct a thorough assessment of your population to determine whether you're actually on track or whether you've been overly optimistic in your estimates, which wouldn't be surprising given that optimism is basically required to attempt snail farming in the first place. You've developed a system for measuring snails using a piece of string marked with knots at regular intervals, pressing the string against the shell and counting knots to estimate diameter, and this method is imprecise but consistent enough to track growth trends over time. The largest adults have reached approximately the size of walnuts, which is respectable but not quite the fist-sized specimens that command premium prices, and you calculate that they need at least 6 more weeks of growth to reach optimal market size, which aligns reasonably well with your original timeline, though you're building in extra weeks as buffer against unexpected problems. The juvenile snails from your first breeding cycle have grown noticeably, their shells developing the characteristic spiral patterns and colour variations that make each one subtly unique, and about 20 of them look healthy enough that they'll probably survive to adulthood, and represent the first generation of snails that you can claim complete responsibility for from egg to market, assuming you successfully navigate the remaining weeks without major disasters. You've started thinking of these juveniles differently than the breeding stock you purchased from Philin, feeling more personal investment in their success because they represent the validation of your methods and your ability to manage the complete life cycle rather than just maintaining animals someone else raised. This distinction probably matters more to you than to anyone else, and the snails certainly don't care about the philosophical implications of their origins, but farming seems to be full of these arbitrary emotional attachments to specific outcomes and arbitrary ways of measuring success beyond simple profit calculations. The feeding routine has become more refined based on observation and experimentation, and you've learned that snails show clear preferences for certain foods at certain times, becoming more interested in protein-rich options like the grain mixture from Diaclaus when they're actively growing, and more interested in simple greens when they're maintaining weight or preparing to mate. You've also noticed that snails seem to enjoy variety, becoming more enthusiastic eaters when you rotate through different vegetable types rather than providing the same food repeatedly. And whether this is because variety provides better nutrition, or because snails have taste preferences complex enough to experience boredom, is unclear, but the practical result is the same regardless of the underlying mechanism. You now maintain a mental rotation of available foods, trying to ensure that snails encounter different options across any given week, and this has become complicated enough that you've started marking your wax tablet with feeding schedules to avoid accidentally providing cabbage 5 days in a row because you forgot what you fed them yesterday. Water management has also become more sophisticated as you've learned to read environmental conditions and adjust irrigation accordingly, providing more water on hot dry days and less on cool humid days, trying to maintain consistent soil moisture without creating the kind of waterlogged conditions that promote harmful bacteria or fungal growth. The multiple drip points that Philin suggested have proven useful, allowing you to create zones with slightly different moisture levels within the same enclosure, and snails naturally sort themselves into these zones based on their individual preferences, with some clustering near the wettest areas and others preferring spots that are merely damp rather than saturated. This self-sorting behavior suggests that snails have more agency in selecting their microenvironment than you initially credited them with, and you've started designing the enclosure to offer more variety in conditions, rather than trying to maintain uniform perfection, understanding that perfection might mean different things to different snails. Philin returns during this week with another farmer in tow, a woman named Xanthi who runs a much larger operation near Megara, and who apparently wants to see what innovations smaller farmers are developing. And you're initially intimidated by her presence because she's clearly more experienced and successful than you are, operating at a scale that probably involves employees and formal business structures, rather than one person carrying water buckets and having extended conversations with invertebrates. Xanthi examines your enclosure with the kind of clinical assessment that makes you nervous, and she asks technical questions about feeding ratios, and calcium supplementation, and seasonal mortality rates that you answer as honestly as possible, while acknowledging the limitations of your data. And she nods and takes notes and provides feedback that's surprisingly constructive given that you're technically competitors in the same market, though the market is apparently large enough that cooperation makes more sense than rivalry, at least for now. She tells you that your operation is well designed for its scale and that your attention to detail is evident in the health of your stock, which is high praise coming from someone who clearly knows what she's talking about. And she suggests a few modifications including better drainage in certain areas, and the addition of more hiding spots for juveniles using stacked flat stones that create multi-level habitat complexity. She also warns you about autumn rains, which can flood enclosures if drainage isn't adequate, and suggests that you dig shallow channels around the perimeter to direct water away from the main growing area. The 13th week begins with a sky the colour of diluted clay wash, and you take it as a sign that the rainy season is preparing its slow theatrical entrance. You're not worried yet, but you do feel a faint stirring of anticipatory dread, the kind you get when you remember that you promised to fix something last month, and now the season that will test it is approaching with the patience of a god who already knows you're not ready. You stand beside the enclosure with your hands on your hips, assessing the soil, the drainage channels, the arrangement of stones Xanthi recommended, and you gently nudge one of the juveniles off a pebble to check whether the surface still dries properly in the morning sun. Everything looks reasonable. Reasonable, however, is not the same thing as resilient. You spend the morning deepening the drainage trench around the perimeter. It's a repetitive task, the kind of thing that settles into your muscles without any real need for conscious thought, and you find yourself drifting into an easy rhythm. Scoop, lift, shake dirt, repeat until the whole trench becomes consistent in depth and slope. You pause occasionally to glance at the snails and reassure yourself that they still exist, as if there's a possibility they might all simply evaporate into thin air while your back is turned. They don't, of course. They continue nibbling leaves with the sort of slow determination that seems almost philosophical.
You check the juveniles next. These small, delicate beings are somehow the constant source of both pride and anxiety, a contradiction you've come to accept as part of this entire enterprise. Their shells have grown sturdier. When you gently tap one shell with your fingernail, the sound is firmer, less hollow, and it tells you something important. Your calcium supplementation strategy seems to be working. You think of all the crushed limestone and ground eggshells you've painstakingly mixed into their diet, and you feel a strange, disproportionate sense of victory, as though you've outsmarted nature. You haven't, of course. You've just learned to cooperate with it. Your feeding rotation feels smoother now too, almost like running a kitchen for very tiny, very slow customers. Today is beet green day, with a side of barley scrapings, and the moment you scatter the leaves, you watch the snails perform their version of enthusiasm, which is mostly a slightly faster wiggle of their eye stalks and a gentle migration toward the food source. You appreciate the gesture anyway, Their approach has the quiet charm of watching a crowd file into a theatre, patient but with purpose.
The adults are still growing, though at a pace that feels almost intentionally designed to test your resolve. They're heavier now when you pick them up, their bodies expanding more confidently out of their shells, the mucus trails thicker and clearer. You measure a few with your string and knot system, your scientific masterpiece, and find that several have gained more than a knot's worth of diameter since last week. Progress is progress, even when measured with artisanal string technology. You take a short break to sit on a flat stone and scribble on your wax tablet, updating feeding notes, growth observations, and a small doodle of a snail wearing a laurel wreath. You don't know why you drew it, but you leave it there anyway. You're beginning to understand how farmers end up talking to themselves. It's not madness, it's just that the snails aren't particularly responsive conversational partners, and someone has to fill the silence. Late in the afternoon, a soft wind rolls in from the sea, carrying the faint scent of salt and kelp. The air becomes cooler, and the snails perk up noticeably. You've learned that snails prefer this kind of weather-moist air, diffused light, air thick enough to drink, so you let them wander longer than usual before guiding them back toward the shaded areas. You suspect some of the adults are considering escaping, not out of malice but out of pure curiosity. A snail's curiosity is slow and manageable, but you still decide to reinforce the smaller gaps in the enclosure wall. As twilight stretches long shadows across the ground, you take one last walk along the enclosure's perimeter. You listen to the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional distant bleat of a goat, and the murmur of your own footsteps. You realize that you've begun to recognize individual snails. Not by name, you are not that far gone yet, but by shell color, spiral shape, or subtle patterns. They are becoming familiar the way street corners or old chairs become familiar. Quietly, gradually, without announcement. You end the day with a slow exhale, brushing dirt off your hands. 13 weeks completed. The snails are alive. The drainage looks good. The juveniles are growing. The adults are bulking up. You have not yet ruined everything beyond repair. You count this as a win, maybe even a major one. When you finally leave the enclosure and close the wooden gate behind you, you feel that calm, sleepy satisfaction that comes from a day spent doing something utterly ordinary yet strangely meaningful. Snail farming may not be glorious, but it is steady, and steadiness, you're learning, is its own quiet kind of comfort. The 14th week arrives with a light drizzle tapping gently on the roof of your small shed, the sort of rain that encourages you to stay inside a few extra minutes, listening to the soft percussion and pretending you're not procrastinating. When the drizzle eases into a foggy stillness, you take it as a cue to begin your morning rounds. The air smells of wet earth and thyme, and you step toward the enclosure with that half-awake calm that comes only on humid mornings. Everything feels slower, softer, like the world is wrapped in wool. Inside the enclosure, the snails are already awake, which is slightly irritating because you like to believe that you control the schedule, not them. Several adults have climbed the walls, leaving shimmering trails that catch the diffused morning light. You gently pluck each wanderer from the upper stones and place them back onto the soil, reminding them, verbally, though you know it's pointless, that their job is to eat and grow, not pursue mountaineering as a hobby. The rain has dampened the soil beautifully, and you kneel to test the moisture levels with your fingers, pressing into the substrate until you feel the cool, springy texture beneath the top layer. Perfect. Not too soggy, not too dry. You think Xanthi would approve. You predict a good growth week ahead, though predicting anything in snail farming sometimes feels like reading omens from tea leaves. You bring out today's food, chopped cucumber skins, a handful of barley chaff and a small offering of ground chickpeas. The mixture looks unimpressive, but to snails it's apparently fine cuisine. As you scatter the food in thin arcs, you watch the adults emerge from hiding places with the slowness of legendary heroes rising from a centuries-long slumber, except with less drama and significantly more mucus. They begin their morning feast, scraping gently at the food with their tiny radulae in motions so subtle you can barely see them. You check the juveniles next, lifting the stacked stones to ensure no one is trapped or overcrowded. They look healthy, glossy, plump, shells thickening with each passing week. You count them one by one, and the number matches what you expect, which is immensely satisfying. There is something deeply comforting about things staying exactly where you left them, especially when those things are notoriously escapist mollusks. Around midday, you notice something unusual. A small cluster of adults gathering near the moisture trough, nudging one another with a kind of deliberate clumsiness. You recognize the signs. This is pre-mating behavior. You weren't expecting another breeding cycle so soon, but nature doesn't consult your timeline. You sigh, part amusement and part weariness, because more mating means more eggs, and more eggs mean more work, and more work means you will inevitably spend the next several nights worrying about whether the new batch will survive. Still, you prepare the soil in the shaded corner, you loosen it, enrich it with calcium-rich dust, and smooth the surface into a shallow bed. You don't have to do this technically, but you've grown accustomed to supporting their whims. You tell yourself that you're simply being responsible, but the truth is that you've become strangely invested in the idea of your snail lineage expanding. It's absurd in a charming way, like rooting for a team that moves at 1 centimeter per minute. A little later, while adjusting a stone near the drainage channel, you spot something alarming, a faint trail leading out of a narrow gap in the enclosure wall. A large snail-sized trail. Your heart jumps, not dramatically, but enough to disrupt your breathing rhythm. You follow the trail a short distance into the brush and find the culprit leisurely attached to a mint plant, looking extremely pleased with itself. You retrieve the runaway with the exasperated tenderness of a parent collecting a wandering toddler and mentally add patch wall gap to your afternoon tasks. Once the escape hazard is handled, you spend some time reinforcing the entire perimeter. It's tedious work but strangely meditative. You press stones deeper into the soil, wedge small gaps with gravel, and scrape away moss that might loosen the structure. Snail proofing is becoming one of your core skills, which is not something you ever expected to say about your life. The afternoon drifts on, quiet and uneventful. You observe the snails eating, crawling, resting, repeating. Their world is small but self-sufficient, and you find yourself feeling unexpectedly peaceful while watching them. There's something grounding about creatures that are never in a hurry. They remind you that survival isn't always about speed, it's about persistence and occasional dampness. As the sky darkens toward evening, humidity rises again, and the snails grow more active. You sit near the enclosure, elbows on your knees, listening to the soft nighttime chorus of distant frogs and the faraway hum of village life settling into its own rhythm. You watch a juvenile navigate around a stone, pausing every few millimeters as if contemplating the meaning of existence. You can relate. By the time you finally stand and stretch, fireflies begin flickering along the edge of the field. You feel the slow, pleasant ache of a long day, the kind that signals honest work done without urgency or chaos. Week 14 is ending, and the snails are thriving. You walk home in the dim light, feeling strangely aligned with the universe, or at least aligned with your small corner of it. The 15th week begins with the kind of bright Athenian morning that seems specifically designed to trick farmers into thinking everything will go smoothly. The sky is a soft, washed-out blue, the kind you remember from frescoes in the Agora, where artisans insisted on portraying the heavens as gentle and cooperative. You step outside, stretch your arms until your shoulders pop, and breathe in air that smells faintly of olive leaves and cool stone. The kind of air that makes you believe, however briefly, that snail farming is a noble calling and not a daily test of your patience. As you walk toward the enclosure, you pass your neighbor Menandros, who is already wide awake and sweeping dust from his doorway as if dust were a personal insult. He gives you a nod and calls out, "Kalimera!" with the upbeat tone of someone not currently responsible for a growing population of mollusks. You return the greeting, silently envying his uncomplicated morning. The enclosure greets you with a glistening network of fresh silvery trails, illuminated by the rising sun. The adults appear especially active, perhaps encouraged by the mild temperatures and the recent moisture. You notice a few perched dramatically on the flat rocks you installed after Xanthi's visit, looking almost like philosophers preparing to debate the merits of damp soil versus slightly damp soil. You place your hand on one of the flat stones. It's cool, smooth, still holding the night air. You can almost imagine the snails appreciating these subtle qualities, tiny connoisseurs of microclimates. You kneel by the shaded corner where yesterday's mating activity suggested an imminent egg-laying event. Sure enough, there are fresh signs of digging small disruptions in the soil, faint indentations, the telltale churned earth of determined snail labor. You brush the soil aside with 2 fingers and discover a smooth patch where the surface has been packed down. A nest. A fresh one. You exhale slowly, a mixture of satisfaction and dread. Another batch of eggs. Another cohort to monitor. Another round of sleepless nights checking moisture levels and worrying about fungal threats. You gather your feeding supplies, chopped grape leaves, and palofala, wilted lettuce from the Agora vendor who always insists on calling you my friend, and a small amount of barley meal mixed with powdered eggshells. You scatter the food in measured arcs, careful not to create dense piles that could attract ants, your eternal rivals. The adults move toward the food with the same gentle determination that you've come to respect. Watching them eat has become a strangely grounding ritual, a reminder that even in a world powered by ambition, noise, and the constant boasting of eager traders, there exists a creature fully committed to the art of slowness. You check the juveniles next. Beneath the stacked stones, your makeshift zophos, a tiny underworld for tiny beings. They've arranged themselves in clusters. Their shells have darkened, the spirals clearer, the edges smoother. Several look nearly large enough to join the general population soon. You feel a small thrill, the kind that rushes in unexpectedly, like finding an extra coin you forgot you had. You tap one gently, it retracts, then slowly extends again, eye stalks reaching toward the air as if verifying your intentions. You apologize out loud. It seems polite. Around mid-morning you notice something unsettling. Small holes near the western wall of the enclosure. Not snail-dug holes, these look like the early attempts of some burrowing insect, perhaps beetles or ants, considering a hostile takeover. You sigh and set to work immediately. You reinforce the wall with packed clay, wedge in pebbles gathered from the Ilissos riverbank, and smooth the surface with water. You mutter something half sarcastic to Hermes, god of boundaries, suggesting that he might show a little more enthusiasm in guarding yours. The sun climbs higher, heating the stones, and the snails retreat into their favorite shaded havens. You take this opportunity to fetch fresh water. The well is only a short walk away, but the uphill return trip always feels longer, especially while carrying a heavy amphora against your hip. A pair of children run past you, chasing each other with sticks shaped like swords, shouting Spartiates Ilai, as if Sparta's greatest warriors spent their days whacking each other with tree branches. You smile despite yourself. Back at the enclosure, you refill the drip points, watching as the water seeps gently into the soil. The scent of wet earth rises, comforting and homelike, if homelike is defined by the quiet presence of 200 moisture-loving creatures. By late afternoon, a breeze drifts in from the Saronic Gulf, the kind of sea breeze that makes even the laziest leaves rustle. You settle onto a low stone bench and begin updating your wax tablet with today's observations. Egg-laying confirmed juveniles, growing well, ant incursion thwarted, snails fed varied diet, emotional state, cautiously hopeful with undertones of indignation at insects. As the light softens in golden evening tones, you make one last slow walk along the perimeter. The olive trees beyond the enclosure rustle with a sound like a deep sigh. The snails emerge again, gliding across the soil in unhurried lines, leaving trails that reflect the last flickers of sunlight like small shimmering rivers. You breathe in, long and deep. Another week underway, another day completed. Snail farming continues, strange, slow, and unexpectedly meaningful, like a story Homer forgot to include. The 16th week begins with the faint scent of roasted sesame drifting across the fields from someone's kitchen hearth, an aroma so distracting that you momentarily forget your responsibilities and imagine warm flatbread instead. But responsibility wins, as it usually does, and you make your way toward the enclosure, passing through morning shadows cast by fig trees whose branches stretch lazily toward the pale sky. You push open the wooden gate, its hinges groaning like an elderly philosopher preparing to deliver unsolicited wisdom, and step inside. Right away, you see the adults clustered around the feeding area, which tells you something important. They're hungry, and if you don't act quickly they will begin climbing the walls in protest. Snail protest is slow but surprisingly persistent. You begin your inspection with the adults, noting their increased weight. When you lift one of the larger individuals, whom you've privately nicknamed Megalios because of his impressive shell size, it feels satisfyingly heavy. You measure him with your knotted string. He's grown nearly a full knot since last week. At this rate he'll be ready for market near the 17th or 18th week, right on schedule. You offer a handful of lettuce shreds and watch his eye stalks bob in what you interpret as gratitude. Next, you check yesterday's egg site. The soil feels slightly disturbed again, meaning additional eggs were laid overnight. You gently sweep the top layer aside and find the smooth, rounded forms beneath. Tiny, glistening, delicate. So many new snails, each no larger than a pearl. You smooth the soil back over them with great care. The task feels ceremonial in a way, like tending a sacred hearth or maintaining a small shrine to Demeter, goddess of growth and quiet miracles. Around late morning, something unexpected happens. A visitor approaches. You recognize him before he reaches the enclosure. It's Phaedros, a fisherman from the coast who once tried to convince you that octopus ink was a universal remedy for sadness. He carries a small basket and waves as he nears. "I brought you something," he calls out. You're immediately suspicious, but curiosity wins. Inside the basket are discarded cuttlefish bones, chalky, pale, lightweight, excellent calcium sources. You look at him with surprise. "For your, what do you call them again? Salicae?" he says, mispronouncing Salicaria snails with confidence. You thank him, genuinely this time. You didn't expect such a useful gift. He shrugs and says, "They wash ashore all the time. Figured your little army might like them." Then he ambles off, leaving you with a basket that will save you considerable effort. You crumble a few pieces into powder, scatter it around the enclosure, and keep the rest stored safely in your shed. You spend midday cleaning and reorganizing feeding stations, removing old leaves before they rot, adjusting stone placements, and tightening the woven reed panels on the walls to prevent more escape attempts. You think again about the runaway you found last week attached smugly to a mint plant. No more freedom quests, you mutter as you pack soil around a loose stone. The weather shifts in the afternoon. Clouds gather over Mount Hymettos, casting a soft bluish-grey light across the land. This is snail weather ideal. Cool, damp. You watch as the snails grow livelier, their movements more confident. Juveniles explore the top of stones they previously avoided, and adults glide with notable energy. You sense an opportunity for optimal feeding and scatter chopped carrot greens, which are instantly met with enthusiastic participation. As enthusiastic as snails can get anyway. You take a slow walk outside the enclosure to check the surrounding terrain. Wild thyme thymos grows thick along the southern border, and its purple blossoms attract bees whose buzzing provides a lazy, soothing soundtrack. A lizard darts across the path and vanishes beneath a rock, reminding you that the world outside the enclosure moves at a very different pace. When you return, you hear a faint scratching sound, soft but insistent. You investigate and find an adult snail attempting once again to squeeze through a gap between two stones. The determination is impressive but misplaced. You block the gap with a piece of broken ceramic, and give the snail a gentle nudge back toward the center of the enclosure. "Nice try," you whisper. By sunset, the fields turn golden, and the snails settle into their evening routines. You sit on your low bench, rubbing a sore spot on your wrist from carrying water earlier, and watch them move like tiny living commas across the earth. Your notes for the day include: new eggs laid, cuttlefish bone acquisition, wall reinforcements, no major disasters. A good day by any measure. As darkness thickens, crickets begin their nightly rhythm, and the distant lights of Athens flicker faintly against the horizon. You close the enclosure gate gently, as if not to wake anyone. and walk home under a cooling sky. 16 weeks completed. You are tired, but it is the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from steady work, growing things, and living life at a pace closer to the snails than the shouting merchants of the agora. The 17th week begins with a strange sound, something between a soft tapping and a faint scraping. At first you assume it's just a bird pecking at the fig tree again, but when you draw closer to the enclosure, you realize the noise is coming from inside. This is alarming because snails are not known for creating any sound at all, unless you count the quiet dignity of their existence. Curious and mildly concerned, you lift the reed panel and step inside. The mystery reveals itself quickly. Two of the larger adults have wedged themselves beneath a cluster of stones and are pushing, very slowly but very persistently, against a flat slab you added after Xanthi's visit. They're trying to rearrange their shelter. Whether this is a communal housing project or just a misguided attempt to redecorate, you have no idea, but you respect the effort. You kneel down and watch them for a while, the way you might observe two particularly unhurried carpenters debating the placement of a beam. The soil vibrates slightly with each tiny shove. You feel almost rude interrupting, but after several minutes you decide it's safer to adjust the stones yourself rather than let them destabilize the whole structure. You slide the slab into a more secure position. The snails stop pushing and simply sit there, like workers whose supervisor has stepped in and fixed their mistake. No hard feelings, presumably. You begin your morning tour, starting with the juveniles. Their shells have taken on subtle hues, light browns, pale ochres and faint bluish streaks that remind you of the worn stones along the Panathenaic Way. You gently lift a few of the larger ones. Their weight, modest but noticeable, tells you they are right on track. You set them back down and sprinkle a little powdered cuttlefish bone from the gift Phaedros delivered last week. The juveniles converge on it like slow, polite devotees around a shrine. The air is cooler today, touched by a breeze from the north. Autumn is approaching. You can smell it in the dryness of the wind and see it in the shifting shadows as the sun takes a lower path across the sky. You make a mental note to prepare for the seasonal rains that Xanthi warned you about. Drainage channels, reinforcement of the western wall, maybe adding raised mounds of soil where snails can escape pooling water. You'll need to finish all that before the heavier storms sweep in from the Gulf. Around mid-morning you hear footsteps. You look up to see young Themistocles, no connection to the famous one, though he likes to claim distant relation just to impress girls at the well. He's breathless and waving his arms. "Your snails are famous," he declares. You blink. This is not a sentence you were prepared to hear today. He explains, between gasps, that a merchant named Diodoros is telling people in the Agora about the ambitious new snail farmer near the outskirts, and apparently he described your enclosure as ingenious and cleverly designed. You wonder if Diodoros is confusing you with someone else, but Themistocles insists that he heard the details: stacked stones, multi-level shelters, grain mixtures, and even snails the size of walnuts. That last part, at least, is true. You thank him, though you're not sure whether this news is good or deeply inconvenient. Fame is not something you are aiming for. Snail fame doubly so. You imagine crowds showing up wanting to see the miracle snails of Attica, and suddenly you're responsible for managing expectations. This is not a responsibility you want added to your schedule. Still, you return to your work, now with the unsettling awareness that strangers may be discussing your snails as if they're part of some new culinary trend. You walk the perimeter next, testing each section of the wall. The clay-packed repairs you made earlier are holding well. You find no signs of ants today, thank the gods. You also find 3 adults sunning themselves near the edge, which is surprising because sunning is not typical snail behavior. Perhaps they are enjoying the warmth. You gently relocate them to a shaded spot, reminding them that their shells may be tough, but they're not fireproof. By midday you prepare to feed the adults. You've brought fresh vine leaves from a vineyard near Piraeus, donated by an old man who said, take them! The snails will appreciate them more than I do." You tear the leaves into soft strips and scatter them in wide arcs. The snails move toward them, eye stalks lifted like small periscopes. You take a moment to sit down on the stone bench. Your knees crack like amphorae being tapped open. You stretch your back and rub your temples. Farming, even snail farming, is not gentle on the body. As the day warms, clouds drift in slowly from the east, thin, wispy streaks like the brushstrokes of a half-distracted painter. The snails respond to the softened light with increased activity, gliding across the damp paths you've created. You watch them, feeling oddly grounded by their slow, measured pace. Their world is small, simple, predictable. Yours, less so. Later in the afternoon, you begin marking your wax tablet with new entries, shell measurements, feeding quantities, soil conditions. You add today's note, possible public interest developing, with a question mark. Perhaps you'll leave that part vague. By sunset, the enclosure glows in the honeyed light of early evening. Birds settle into nearby olive branches. The sounds of distant chatter drift from households preparing their meals. You make one last circuit of the enclosure, satisfied that everything is stable and calm. You leave through the wooden gate, latching it gently behind you. 17 weeks down, the work continues, slow, careful, somehow meaningful. Just like the snails themselves. The 18th week begins with an unmistakable chill in the air, a crispness that brushes your skin the moment you step outside, signaling that the seasons are shifting whether you're ready or not. You wrap your himaion a bit tighter and breathe out into the morning light, watching your breath turn faintly visible for a moment before dissolving. Autumn in Attica is never harsh, but it has a way of sneaking in, tapping you on the shoulder like a polite messenger, reminding you that time is passing. You reach the enclosure and pause for a long moment before entering. Something is different today. The air smells richer, earthier, like soil that has been freshly turned. When you lift the reed panel, you understand why. The snails, every single one of them, are awake. Not just awake, but actively gliding across the enclosure as if attending some sort of early morning assembly. You've never seen them all moving at once. Usually there are the late risers, the stubborn sleepers, and the individuals who seem to spend half the day debating whether movement is even worth the effort. But today, it's as if someone rang a tiny bell. You kneel and observe more closely. Their movements are purposeful. Their eye stalks twitch. A few seem to be examining the soil near the drainage trenches you dug last week, as if inspecting your work. You resist the urge to ask them for feedback. You begin your routine, starting with the new juveniles. The second generation is growing rapidly. Their shells now sport subtle ridges and faint spirals, delicate but well-formed. You lift one carefully between your fingertips and test its weight, surprisingly sturdy. You place it back and watch it stretch forward, feeling almost proud. You've raised these little creatures, you, who once couldn't keep a basil plant alive for more than 2 weeks. You distribute their food carefully, chopped cabbage, grape leaves, and a small quantity of ground barley. You add powdered cuttlefish bone for calcium, and sprinkle fresh water lightly across the soil to maintain moisture. The snails gather, forming slow-moving clusters like miniature processions. Around mid-morning, you hear distant thunder roll across the sky from the direction of Mount Parnes. Storm clouds. You look up and see them gathering, dark, heavy, layered clouds that promise real rain. You feel your stomach twist. The enclosure is prepared, mostly. But storms in Attica are unpredictable. Sometimes they pass gently, sometimes they unleash water like Zeus himself is doing some over-enthusiastic spring cleaning. You immediately begin reinforcing your drainage channels, deepening them with a wooden stick and smoothing their edges so water will flow cleanly away. You check the walls for weak spots, tapping the clay patches for soft areas. You even move one of the larger stones to create an elevated platform where snails can escape rising water if needed. They watch you with solemn stillness, like tiny monks witnessing the building of a shrine. The first raindrops arrive just past midday, slow, cold, spaced far apart at first. You stand inside the enclosure, listening to them hit the stones and soil with soft taps. The snails respond instantly. Some retreat into their shells, others glide toward the shelter you created, and a few bold individuals continue exploring as if rain is merely an optional inconvenience. But then the rain intensifies. Not storm level yet, but steady, insistent. You stay with the snails longer than usual, adjusting water flow, clearing small clumps of soil from the drainage lines, making sure the water isn't pooling anywhere dangerous. You're soaked within minutes, your himaion clinging to you like an overly affectionate octopus. Eventually you retreat to the edge of the enclosure and take shelter under the narrow awning you built earlier in the season. From here, you watch the rain fall in thick, slanted streaks. The olive trees bend slightly. The soil darkens. The snails huddle together under stones, forming slow, careful clusters. You feel strangely protective, like a shepherd watching over the smallest, quietest flock in Greece. The storm lasts nearly an hour. When the rain finally lightens, you step back into the enclosure and inspect everything with the seriousness of a general surveying battlefield aftermath. Miraculously, the drainage worked. No flooding, no washed-out soil. The snails, though damp and slightly offended, seem unharmed. You let out a long breath you didn't realize you were holding. As the clouds drift away, the late afternoon sun breaks through in golden beams that illuminate the wet stones and glistening snail trails. The enclosure shimmers like a small, enchanted valley in the middle of Attica. You stand there, exhausted but victorious. The snails begin to emerge again, slowly at first, then with confidence. They glide across the refreshed soil, as if pleased with your efforts. You feel a surprising warmth in your chest, pride mixed with relief. By evening, everything is calm again. You finish your notes, marking the day as rain event successful. You close the gate softly, almost reverently, and head home through the cool night air. 18 weeks complete. And you are still here. Still tending, still learning, still moving forward, slow, steady, and somehow always in rhythm with the snails themselves. The 22nd week arrives with a quiet heaviness, as if the air itself has been draped in a thin veil of summer fatigue, and you find yourself moving more slowly through the snail enclosure, pacing your steps like someone practicing mindful walking long before such a thing becomes a trend. The snails, meanwhile, seem perfectly content in the warmth, retreating into shaded corners beneath overturned amphora shards and flat stones, occasionally venturing out when you sprinkle a delicate layer of water across the soil. You move the way a caretaker moves who understands the rhythm of a place, brushing aside dry fig leaves and checking the moisture beneath each layer of straw. And for a moment you catch yourself humming an old song that a fisherman from Piraeus once taught you. The kind of tune that travels far in the world but ends up meaning very little beyond keeping steady time. The enclosure smells faintly of mint this week because you've begun adding crushed leaves to the feed mixture, following a tip from a farmer in Corinth who swore that his snails grew faster when fed aromatic greens. You suspect that this is either an exaggeration or a long-standing superstition, but the snails do seem particularly enthusiastic whenever the mint appears, extending their delicate tentacles like miniature diviners seeking prophecy in the air. You watch one especially large snail, whom you have accidentally started calling Plotarchos in your head even though you've sworn not to name your livestock, drag its way through the mint-scented mixture as if evaluating its worth. Your own life has fallen into a pattern that feels oddly stable, almost monastic in its predictability. At sunrise you open the shutters, stretching your shoulders as the faint light of Helios sweeps through the room, warming the clay walls. You make a small breakfast, usually barley bread dipped in honey, sometimes olives if you remembered to buy them, and then you walk to the enclosure with the quiet determination of someone who has accepted that they will be doing this for the foreseeable future. You check for escaped snails, though it has been days since one last tried to make a break for freedom, and then you gently refill the small terracotta water basins. You've learned to listen for the soft sound of dripping water from the irrigation lines, a kind of steady tapping that now feels like the heartbeat of your little farm. By mid-morning, the sun climbs high enough that you must cover the enclosure with woven mats of reeds to prevent direct glare from drying the soil too quickly. You adjust these mats like curtains, creating shaded pockets that look almost theatrical, as if you're preparing a stage for a very slow performance that no one else in Greece will ever witness. And perhaps that's what this is. A secret show that you alone attend, watching incremental growth that is invisible in the moment but undeniable over time. Around this point in the day, villagers often pass by on their way to the agora. You can hear their voices drifting along the path, someone arguing about the price of olives, someone complaining about a cousin who never repays loans, someone gossiping about a new proposal made at the boule. These distant conversations feel like reminders that the outside world still spins at its usual pace, even while your tiny realm of snails insists on moving at the speed of slow geological change. In the afternoon, you kneel in the soil to examine the juveniles from your second generation, who are just beginning to develop shells strong enough to handle gentle handling. Their colours are lighter than the adults, with faint ivory spirals that look like someone attempted to paint them with diluted milk. You count them carefully, 31 in total, and record the number on your wax tablet, even though you suspect the tally will shift as some thrive and others fade. Farming in Greece, as every elder reminds you, is a constant negotiation between hope and inevitability. When evening arrives, the temperature drops enough that the snails become fully active, gliding across the soil with an elegance that would almost be beautiful if it weren't so absurdly slow. You sit on a small stone at the enclosure's edge, letting the last golden light of the day fall across your face. You trace the shadows stretching over Mount Hymettus in the distance, and imagine that, somewhere beyond it, other snail farmers are doing the exact same thing, tending their small domains, whispering encouragement to creatures that cannot possibly hear them, and wondering whether this strange occupation will ever become easier. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the shifting of leaves and the soft, rhythmically uneven tapping of water droplets. And in that quiet space, you feel something like peaceful acceptance settling over you, because even though snail farming has been more work than you ever expected, it has also tethered you to a gentler pace of living, a pace that feels strangely correct in a world that spends too much time racing toward things no one remembers a few years later. You wake the next morning to the sound of distant thunder rolling in from the Saronic Gulf, a low and steady pulse that suggests a storm is approaching, with the kind of theatrical flair only Greek weather seems to enjoy. By the time you reach the enclosure, the air is already thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes even the olive trees appear sluggish. The snails, however, seem invigorated by the moisture. Several adults have climbed halfway up the walls, stretching their bodies upward as if greeting the incoming rain with the enthusiasm of worshippers welcoming a minor god. You begin your usual inspection, though today you move faster, anticipating the sudden downpour that could transform your carefully maintained soil into a muddy swamp. Xanthi's warning about poor drainage echoes in your mind, and you check the shallow ditches you dug around the perimeter. They look functional, though you still don't entirely trust them. Not after last month's incident where water pooled unexpectedly and half your juveniles had to be rescued from accidental bath time. By mid-morning the clouds thicken, turning the sky a deep grey that resembles polished slate. The first raindrops fall gently at first, tapping the woven reed mats with a sound that feels almost musical. You tighten the mat's ties, adjusting their angle to create better runoff. The snails retreat beneath stones and amphora pieces with an instinctive swiftness that always surprises you, as though they know that Greek storms are rarely content to remain mild. The rain intensifies, becoming a steady curtain that blurs the edges of the enclosure. You move through the space like a harried Athenian caretaker, checking moisture levels and redistributing small mounds of soil to prevent unwanted rivulets from forming. Every so often you stop to watch the snails, reassuring yourself that they are tucked safely out of harm's way. One adult, larger than most, with a shell patterned in dark ochre swirls, seems determined to reach higher ground, inching its way up a stone as if it has somewhere important to be. You let it continue. You admire the determination. Eventually the thunder cracks overhead in a theatrical rumble that startles even you, though you'd never admit it. You tell yourself you are simply responding appropriately to environmental stimuli, which is a very dignified way of admitting you almost jumped. As the storm settles into a steady rhythm, you take shelter beneath the olive tree near the enclosure, leaning against its trunk as the scent of wet soil and crushed greenery surrounds you. You watch the stormwater gather in the drainage ditches, flowing in thin streams down toward the lower field. The system seems to be working. You let out a slow breath you didn't realize you were holding. A few villagers pass by on the path, hurrying through the rain with their cloaks pulled tightly around their shoulders. One man shouts over the storm to ask if you've lost your mind, standing outside with snails, but his tone is teasing, not judgmental. You wave back, knowing full well that most people already think snail farmers are strange, and a bit of rain won't help your reputation. When the worst of the storm finally passes, the enclosure looks transformed. The soil is dark and rich, glistening with moisture. The snails begin to re-emerge one by one, stretching their bodies toward the now lighter sky, with the kind of gentle enthusiasm that makes you smile despite yourself. You observe them with the careful pride of someone who has spent too long caring about creatures that move at the pace of a drifting cloud. By late afternoon, the sun breaks through in soft golden streaks that light the enclosure with a warm glow. The snails glide across the damp soil like slow-moving pearls, leaving faint trails that catch the light in silvery lines. You kneel down, examining each section of the enclosure with renewed attention. The juveniles are unharmed. The adults appear content. The drainage has held. You stand slowly, stretching your back as you look toward the horizon, where the last remnants of the storm drift away over Salamis. You feel tired but satisfied, the kind of tired that comes from doing necessary work and doing it well. As you walk back toward your home, the air smells of rain-soaked earth and damp olive leaves, familiar scents that remind you that you chose this life, strange as it is, and that for reasons you still don't fully understand, it suits you better than anything else ever has. The 24th week arrives with a deceptive calm, the kind that usually precedes either great progress or a minor disaster. Two outcomes that, in ancient Greek agriculture, often look identical until the very last moment. You step into the enclosure early in the morning, the grass still damp with dew, and you immediately sense that the snails have entered one of their collective growth moods. This is your term, not theirs, though it would not surprise you if the snails truly do coordinate their development like a very slow secret society. Plutarchos, your unofficial champion of the adult cohort, has grown noticeably larger. You lift him gently, feeling the satisfying weight of his shell in your palm. He now resembles a small apricot, and you feel an immediate surge of pride, the kind of deep emotional investment usually reserved for children, rare pottery, or amphorae of wine one intends to brag about for decades. You place him back on the damp soil with a reverence that you pretend is not ridiculous. Your feeding schedule today involves a mix of chopped lettuce from the market, leftover barley mash you rescued from a neighbor's discarded baking, and finely crushed limestone. The limestone dust rises a little in the air as you sprinkle it, catching the early sunlight like tiny stars. You imagine the snails experience this as a luxurious treat, though in reality it's probably just calcium. Essential, yes. Glamorous, no. The juveniles from your second generation now move confidently across the enclosure. Their shells have hardened, showing crisp spirals with faint golden undertones that almost make them look polished. You sit close to them for a while, observing their slow, determined motions. Every so often a breeze carries the scent of thyme from a nearby hillside, and you wonder, not for the first time, if perhaps snails appreciate the aromas of their homeland in ways humans cannot measure. Around midday, your friend and occasional supplier, Diocles, stops by carrying a cloth bag full of grain scraps. He hands it to you with a grin and says he brought a gift for your little philosophers. You thank him, though you're fairly certain the snails philosophize about nothing except moisture levels and food availability. Diocles lingers for a bit, leaning casually on the enclosure wall as he updates you on the latest local gossip. A baker in Athens ruined an entire batch of honey bread. A fisherman claims to have seen a dolphin giving him judgmental looks, and a goat in a nearby village has begun terrorizing laundry lines. You nod politely at each of these stories, grateful for the break in solitude. Snail farming is peaceful, yes, but it is also deeply quiet. You sometimes forget that you can simply talk to humans whenever you want, which is entirely your own fault. When Diocles finally leaves, whistling an off-key tune, you return to the enclosure and begin your midday misting. The water glimmers as it falls, creating a fine cloud that settles across the plants. The snails respond almost instantly. Tiny antennae extend, shells tilt upward, and bodies stretch with the slow enthusiasm of creatures who have no intention of rushing toward anything, ever. As evening approaches, the sky above Attica turns lavender, then rose, then a deepening blue. You sit on the familiar stone you've slowly worn smooth with use, and watch the silhouettes of the olive trees shift in the fading light. The snails glide quietly nearby, tracing small silver lines in the soil. You find yourself feeling an unexpected sense of companionship, a soft, grounding feeling that seems to anchor you to this place more securely than you realized. You reflect on how far you've come. 24 weeks of adjusting water flow, defending your enclosure from opportunistic birds, measuring snail growth with a string, and explaining repeatedly to your neighbors that yes, snail farming is real and, no, you're not losing your mind, or at least not more than the average Athenian. Tomorrow, you remind yourself, is an important day. You will begin selecting which adults are finally approaching market-ready size. You exhale slowly, letting the quiet of the evening settle around you like a soft cloak, and you leave the enclosure with the comforting thought that, somehow, your strange little enterprise is actually working. You wake before dawn, long before the roosters in the village begin their confident but unnecessary announcements. The air is cool and carries a faint mineral scent that always precedes a clear morning. You make your way to the enclosure with a sense of purpose, carrying your measuring string, a small clay cup of water, and a wax tablet where you've drawn careful columns for shell diameters, weights, and your newly added category market potential. The snails are still mostly inactive, curled into themselves in the soft pre-dawn dimness. You gently lift the first adult from the nearest cluster. Its shell is smooth and sturdy, with a satisfying heft, the kind of snail a wealthy Athenian might pay handsomely for, especially if persuaded that this particular snail had been raised on artisan feeds and exclusive watering techniques. These are not lies, technically, just well-branded truths. You begin measuring, wrapping your string around each shell and counting knots. 8 knots for the first, 9 for the second. Plutarchos, predictably, hits 10. Not yet the magnificent 11-knot giant you dream of, but closer each week. You record the numbers carefully, adding small comments like excellent spiral clarity and very enthusiastic eater. You imagine future historians discovering this wax tablet and spending hours debating whether ancient Greek snails were considered sentient beings with distinct personalities. To your surprise, the juveniles are also awake early today. They stretch outward in delicate motions as you work, their tiny shells catching the light of the rising sun. You pause to admire them. Their growth has stabilized, and the mortality rate, something Xanthi warned you to track closely, has held steady at a level she would consider respectable. As the sun climbs fully above the horizon, you begin evaluating potential market-ready adults. In ancient Greece, snail markets are informal yet surprisingly competitive affairs, with farmers from Megara, Eleusis and even Aegina showing off their finest specimens. You imagine yourself among them, presenting your carefully raised snails while trying not to appear too proud. You suspect you will fail at this. Mid-morning brings a soft breeze carrying the scent of pine resin from the hills. You step back to observe the enclosure as a whole, noting where the snails congregate and where the soil retains moisture best. You make a mental note to add more shaded stone clusters near the northern corner, an area the juveniles seem particularly fond of. As you work, an elderly neighbor named Callistratos wanders by, leaning on his walking stick. He peers into the enclosure with mild curiosity, which is more interest than he has shown in anything besides olives and storytelling in the last decade. They look fat, he declares, which is, in snail terms, the highest praise imaginable. He asks whether you plan to sell them at the market in Athens or keep them for breeding. You explain your strategy, and he nods, though you are fairly certain he retains none of it. When he leaves, you continue your selection process, growing more confident with each measurement. 12 adults qualify for preliminary market consideration, with 8 more on the cusp. You feel something warm and steady in your chest, a mix of relief, pride, and the realization that you are, against all odds, becoming competent at this. By late afternoon, the light has softened into a golden hue. You sit down with your wax tablet, reviewing your notes as the snails continue their slow, deliberate explorations. You reflect on how the weeks have stretched and woven themselves into rhythms you didn't expect, how the work has shaped not only your days, but your thoughts, your pace, your sense of time. You glance at Plutarchos, who is currently attempting to climb a stone twice his height. You whisper, "You're getting there," and even though you're speaking to a snail, the words feel strangely fitting for yourself as well. The evening settles around you like silk, and as you close the enclosure for the night, you feel the quiet certainty that tomorrow will bring another step forward, slow, steady, and unmistakably yours. The 26th week begins with a soft, milky dawn that feels almost theatrical in its calmness, as though the gods themselves have decided to give you an aesthetically pleasing sky in exchange for weeks of dealing with mud, unpredictable humidity, and snails who refuse to grow at socially acceptable speeds. You walk toward the enclosure with your usual blend of anticipation and resigned realism, stepping over the uneven stones scattered across your small plot of land, stones that have tripped you at least 5 times, but that you still refuse to move because they belong there. When you enter the enclosure, The snails are already active. This is unusual, since snails are notorious for ignoring the passage of time unless it involves humidity or food. But something feels different today. There is a kind of collective alertness among them, a sense that they are fidgeting in snail terms, tiny adjustments, subtle shifts in posture, tentacles extended slightly higher than normal. You kneel down, resting your elbows on your knees in that ungraceful position you've perfected after months of observing slow-moving creatures. You watch Plotarchos glide toward a patch of damp soil with unusual determination, his shell gleaming faintly like a polished Spartan shield. You notice that several of the juveniles have positioned themselves in a loose crescent formation around one of the flat stones you added weeks ago. You have no explanation for this behavior. Are they basking, plotting, worshipping something? At this point, nothing would surprise you. You begin the morning misting, lifting your clay jug and letting the droplets fall in a steady, controlled stream, an act that has become almost meditative over time. You catch the faint aroma of mint drifting in from the small herb patch you planted near the entrance. You had not intended for the scent to mingle with the enclosure, but the breeze has its own opinions about your layout. Still, the snails seem pleased by it, or at least not displeased, which is nearly the same thing in snail body language. Around mid-morning, Xanthi arrives. You hear her before you see her, the confident, purposeful steps of someone who makes decisions quickly and regrets them rarely. She enters your enclosure with her arms crossed, surveying your snails as though they're recruits in a low-stakes military parade. "It's good," she says, without greeting. Cleaner than before. More structured. You accept the compliment, subtle as it is. Xanthi crouches beside one of the juveniles and lifts it with the easy familiarity of someone who has handled tens of thousands of snails. She examines it, turning it gently in her hands. "Shell quality is excellent," she notes. "Growth rate is above average for this season." You feel a warm swell of pride, though you try to maintain your usual expression of practiced humility, the face you make when pretending not to care about praise while caring deeply. Xanthi straightens and dusts her hands on her tunic. "Have you thought about expanding?" You blink. Expand. The word feels almost mythical, like something whispered by ambitious Athenians dreaming of fame, not snail farmers counting shell knots with strings. You explain your hesitation, costs, time, the need to improve infrastructure before increasing stock. She nods, then suggests a practical approach, constructing a smaller second enclosure to house market-ready adults separately from the breeding population. As she talks, the sun climbs higher, illuminating the enclosure in a warm golden glow. You can see dust particles drifting lazily through the air, and you feel something shift inside you. A subtle but definite recognition that you might actually be capable of growing this operation beyond a hobby fueled by stubbornness and cabbage scraps. After Xanthi leaves, you sit beside your enclosure and think about expansion. The idea frightens you. It also thrills you. Snail farming has become more than a strange experiment. It has become a rhythm, a routine, a quiet anchoring force. Doubling the scale would change the texture of your days. More work, yes, but also more certainty, more potential, more validation that what you're doing is worthwhile. In the late afternoon, you feed the snails a mixture of melon rinds and ground barley. You watch the adults gather around the food in a slow-motion crowd, each one moving at a pace that would embarrass any respectable animal but somehow feels perfect for them. You trace your finger along the ground, following the faint trails they leave, as if mapping a tiny, ever-shifting city. Evening descends slowly over Attica, the hills turning deep purple. You gather your tools and step outside the enclosure. You take one last look at your growing population, your living investment, and you realize something simple, something steady. You're beginning to understand them. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough to feel connected to their slow, patient world. The night breeze carries the scent of rosemary, and you let it wash over you. Tomorrow, you think, will bring decisions. But tonight, you allow yourself the luxury of stopping, breathing, and being quietly proud. You wake to the gentle rumble of distant thunder, the kind that suggests rain is coming but is still considering whether it's worth the effort. You sit up slowly, stretching your arms as the room fills with the warm, dusty scent of overnight breezes pushing through the shutters. You've grown used to the soft unpredictability of Attic weather. Sun 1 hour, humidity the next, a sudden downpour whenever you forget to bring your tools inside. By the time you reach the enclosure, the clouds have thickened into a muted grey canopy. The snails seem delighted. Damp mornings are their version of a festival day. You can almost hear them whispering hellos to one another, dance, though in reality, their celebratory movements are just slightly more enthusiastic glides. You begin by checking the soil. It holds moisture well, but not too much. A delicate balance you've learned to maintain through trial, error, and one memorable week of swamp-like conditions you do not wish to repeat. You lift a handful of earth, crumble it between your fingers, and nod in satisfaction. A farmer in Athens might laugh at your pride over dirt, but they haven't met your snails. As you perform your morning checks, you notice a small disturbance near the western stones. A faint groove in the soil that looks too deep and too linear to have been made by any of your snails. You crouch down, examining it closely. It resembles the mark left by a lizard, or perhaps a bird's searching beak. You feel a tiny spike of caution. Predators are always at-risk hedgehogs, thrushes, even overly curious dogs belonging to neighbors who assure you their animals would never cause trouble. You reinforce the perimeter with a few strategic stones, creating a less inviting path for anything that might attempt to dig or poke around. You make a mental note to check for tracks after the rain. When the first droplets begin to fall, you step inside the enclosure and watch the snails respond. It is almost theatrical how they angle their bodies upward, extending their tentacles to feel each drop as if savoring the artistry of the sky. You sit down on your usual stone, letting the rain soak your hair and tunic. The droplets feel cool, almost metallic, as they slide down your skin. The snails grow more active with each passing minute. The juveniles cluster together, stretching outward, gliding through shallow puddles like tiny philosophers contemplating the nature of water. Even Plutarchos becomes animated, making a valiant attempt to climb the tallest stone in the enclosure, a task he abandons halfway, though you admire the ambition. As the rain intensifies, you feel a quiet joy settle in your chest. Rain means growth. Rain means easier feeding days. Rain means fewer worries about dry soil, and more time to focus on preparing your market-ready adults. Your thoughts drift to the upcoming market trip. You imagine yourself standing among other farmers in the agora, amid sellers of figs, fish, olives, woven baskets, proudly displaying snails raised with more care than anyone expects for creatures that spend their lives gliding across damp leaves. You imagine buyers examining your specimens, admiring their shell size, their coloration, their subtle spirals. You imagine making your first profitable sale and pretending not to be overwhelmed by the accomplishment. The rain eventually softens to a gentle drizzle. You retrieve your wax tablet from inside your home and return to record notes. Rain beneficial. Snails active. Possible predator. Investigate. You draw a small sketch of the suspicious groove in the soil. It is not a good drawing. It resembles a crooked snake or a wandering stick, but it makes you feel prepared. By late afternoon, the clouds part, revealing a pale blue sky washed clean by the storm. The enclosure smells rich, earthy, fresh, alive. You observe the snails one more time before evening, ensuring none of them have wandered into danger zones or climbed into precarious areas. As the light fades, you lean against the wooden post at the enclosure gate. The air is cool, and the distant hills glow faintly in the setting sun. The snails move slowly, undisturbed, each one tracing a gentle arc across the damp soil. You exhale, letting the quiet settle into your bones. You realize that the rhythm of this life, the waiting, the watching, the tiny incremental progress, has become strangely comforting. And as you close the gate for the night, the thought returns to you once again. You're doing well. Slowly, steadily, and exactly in your own way. Night comes slowly to the hills of ancient Greece. Not dramatically, the way poets like to pretend. No blazing sunsets, no thunderous divine announcements, just the soft dimming of the olive groves, the cooling of the stone paths, and the gentle reminder that even snails have their own bedtime rituals. In the quiet hour, when the sky turns dusky lavender, ancient Greek snail farmers would step outside, carrying small clay lamps that flickered like shy stars. Their farms were not farms in the grand Athenian sense, no vast wheat fields, no rows of heavy grapevines, but instead, simple shaded enclosures called kukliotrophea. These were fenced patches of damp earth carefully arranged beneath fig trees, vines, or pergolas, designed to mimic the favorite hiding spots of their slow-shelled residents. You might imagine snail farming as tranquil work, and you'd be correct, perhaps a bit too correct. Many Greek writers noted that tending snails required the patience of a philosopher and the observational skills of a bored shepherd. Farmers would sprinkle water lightly over the soil to encourage movement, watching the snails perk up like tiny, cautious athletes preparing for the world's slowest race. Snails preferred silence. Snail farmers preferred not to break that silence. And so an entire evening might pass with nothing but the sound of crickets, distant goat bells, and the occasional tchit of a farmer whispering encouragement to a particularly lazy mollusk. The primary Greek species cultivated was Helix aspersa, though wealthier farmers sought the larger, richer Helix pomatia, which, according to some hilariously snobbish ancient commentators, possessed the superior flavor profile suitable for symposium dining. One can picture a group of upper-class Athenians reclining on cushioned couches, debating whether a snail's taste should be described as earthy, delicate, or simply slightly damp. To understand why snails were so valued, you must imagine the Greek palate of the time. Fresh snails offered a nutritious, protein-rich meal, but also, crucially, something novel. They were the ancient equivalent of a trendy culinary craze. Rich Athenians treated them like tiny treasures, sometimes sending servants to specific farms known for particularly plump specimens, as if discussing prized jewels instead of sleepy gastropods. Farmers took advantage of this. They fed their snails carefully curated diets, often including bran, ground barley, thyme leaves, and occasionally leftover grape skins. This was considered premium cuisine, a kind of snail gourmet meal plan. The goal? Snails large enough to impress even the pickiest dinner guests at a symposium. Some farmers even whispered to their snails, not because snails understood, of course, but because whispering simply felt appropriate. It maintained the serenity of the night, and in that deep Greek stillness, the snail enclosures glistened like miniature constellations of moving shells reflecting lamplight. When the snails had grown fat and content, they were transferred into clay baskets lined with moist leaves. The farmers treated this task with great delicacy, not out of affection, although surely some grew fond of their more charismatic individuals, but because snails could simply escape. Slowly, yes, comically slowly, but persistently. A neglected basket could transform into a tiny escape museum by morning, each snail leaving a faint silvery trail as evidence of its breakout attempt. But perhaps the most charming detail is this. The Greeks believed snails were symbols of the changing seasons. Their appearance on roads and walls after rain signaled renewal. Their retreat into shells foretold the cold. And their gentle, spiraled forms reminded people of life's slow, reliable cycles. So when a Greek farmer lifted a basket of snails under the moonlight, it wasn't just a food source he carried, it was a symbol of patience, timing, and nature's quiet artistry. In this way, snail farming became less of an occupation and more of a calming ritual, a slow dance between farmer, earth, and the tiny creatures who never hurried, never panicked, and never complicated life with unnecessary drama. A rare quality then, a rare quality now. And as the night deepened over the Greek hills, the farmers would sit on stoops, lamps flickering softly, listening to the land settle into sleep. Snail shells glowed faintly in the dim light, lined up like miniature moons resting in woven baskets. In their stillness, one could almost hear the quiet philosophy of ancient Greece itself. Move slow. Grow gently. Let the world unfold at its own ancient pace. Morning in ancient Greece arrived softly, the way a breeze lifts a curtain without meaning to. There was no rush, not in the snail farms, not among the farmers, and certainly not among the snails, who greeted sunrise with all the urgency of a sleepy cat stretching on a warm stone. As the first golden light brushed across the Cochleotrophea, snail farmers stepped outside, rubbing sleep from their eyes and carrying small pitchers of water. Their task was always the same: dampen the soil. Snails loved moisture, and keeping the ground wet encouraged them to wander, feed, and grow in their unhurried philosophical way. Some farmers swore snails were more active when greeted politely. Others believed silence yielded better results. A few would simply stand beside the enclosures, drinking watered wine and watching the morning unfold, letting the snails do whatever snails do, mostly nothing, with occasional enthusiasm. By mid-morning, the farmers inspected each snail with surprising seriousness. They checked the shells for cracks, admired the curves of the spirals like miniature pieces of art, and assessed size with the same scrutiny Athenians used to judge grapes at the market. A perfectly grown snail brought pride, a sign of attentive care and cooperation with nature. And the work wasn't just practical, it was emotional. Snail farms were quiet sanctuaries, offering a rare escape from the fast, chaotic gossip of the agora, the drama of politics, and the loud debates about who insulted whose sandals at last week's festival. In a world filled with speeches from orators and arguments from philosophers, snail farming offered something revolutionary: peace. It was in this peace that Greek farmers found rhythm. Life slowed. Thought softened. The morning light warmed the stones. Even the goats seemed calmer near the enclosures, perhaps sensing the tranquility. As the day warmed, some snails retreated into shade or curled under large leaves, leaving glimmering trails behind them, faint silver signatures on the stones. Farmers sometimes followed these trails, amused, shaking their heads at the strange thought that these tiny creatures were valuable enough to be served at elite symposiums in Corinth or Athens. But the truly interesting moments came just before midday, when farmers prepared shipments for the market. Snails were gathered into clay pots or woven baskets lined with fig leaves. Transporting snails required gentleness, because a stressed snail could, in a truly admirable act of passive resistance, withdraw entirely into its shell and refuse to emerge for days. Imagine being a merchant waiting at the market, lifting the lid of a basket, and finding nothing but an audience of tightly sealed shells. The snails had chosen violence, very slow, very quiet violence, and the merchant would sigh, knowing he might have to wait hours or days for his inventory to become cooperative again. Yet the demand remained high. Some Greek households kept special recipes for preparing snails. Others believed snails were medicinal, helpful for digestion, coughs, or mystery ailments. Some even saw them as symbols of domestic order, because snails carried their homes with them, always tidy, always organized, never misplacing anything. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, the snail farmers returned to their enclosures one last time, checking the shadows, smoothing soil with their palms, and ensuring no adventurous snail had scaled the fence and embarked on a grand odyssey down the hillside. Evenings in Greece were slow and warm, filled with the scent of thyme and wood smoke. Snail farmers would sit outside their homes, enjoying dinner, often olives, bread, maybe some goat cheese, while baskets of snails rested nearby under nets or cloth coverings. There was no rush, no urgency, no noise, just the simple truth that life, much like snail farming, is best lived slowly. And as the soft Aegean breeze brushed against the trees, farmers listened to the small night sounds, the cicadas, the distant waves, the quiet shifting in the snail baskets. Somewhere in that gentle stillness, one could almost hear the land whispering the same message the snails embodied. Move with patience. Grow with intention. Carry your home and your peace wherever you go. And now, as the last traces of daylight fade from the hills of ancient Greece, you let yourself drift backward through the quiet world you've just walked through, letting the sounds soften, letting the images blur a little at the edges, letting everything feel slower and gentler than before, as though the land itself has settled into a deeper, steadier rhythm, one that carries you effortlessly toward rest. You imagine the Culinary at dusk, its soil still glistening faintly from the morning's watering, the snails tucked comfortably beneath fig leaves and smooth stones, each one curled inside its spiral shell like a tiny moon, resting in its own private sky, and you feel how still everything becomes when the Aegean breeze glides across the earth in long, unhurried breaths. The olive branches no longer move sharply, but instead sway with the grace of someone already half asleep, and somewhere in the distance a shepherd calls to his flock, the sound soft and rounded, like a voice wrapped in wool. You picture yourself sitting beside the old clay enclosure, the air warm and velvety on your skin, the scent of thyme drifting lightly from the hillside, and in the fading light, every stone and shadow feels calm, ancient, and endlessly patient. Nothing demands your attention. Nothing asks you to move quickly. Nothing in this gentle Greek landscape carries even a whisper of urgency. All that remains is the slow exhale of the earth, the quiet ease of creatures who never hurry, and the peaceful sense that time itself has stretched out, long and soft, like a path leading steadily into dream. And as you rest here, in the slow, warm night of the snail farms, you allow yourself to sink deeper into that stillness, carried by the simple truth the ancient farmers lived by. There is no need to rush. The world is gentle. And you too can rest now.